It was February 1946, a frigid New York winter, but the air was alive with the scent of transformation. The Second World War had ended, leaving the old European empires in tatters, and a new global power was stepping into the void. That power was the United States of America, an emerging colossus poised to dominate where others had crumbled. Change was everywhere, tangible, unstoppable. The 40s were drawing to a close, and while the ashes of one war still smouldered, the embers of another were beginning to burn. The Cold War loomed on the horizon, and America was preparing to make alliances with anyone who could serve its purpose, even the most unlikely of partners. Organized crime, once considered a shadowy undercurrent, would soon find itself entangled with the ambitions of global power. But this uneasy alliance was years away. In the here and now, another chapter of history was closing, the era of Charlie Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime. For 20 years, Luciano had reigned over New York, weaving a vast empire of vice and industry. He had come to the United States as a penniless 9-year-old immigrant, fought his way through the mean streets of the Lower East Side, and clawed his way to the top of the underworld. By 1946, the walls were closing in. Exiled from the country he had built his legacy in, Luciano was being deported to Italy, the homeland he barely remembered. On a cold February day, the Laura Keene was docked at Pier 7, Bush Terminal in Brooklyn. At noon, it would sail for Genoa, carrying the man who had orchestrated the very foundations of organized crime in America. This wasn't just the end of a personal reign, it was the beginning of a seismic shift in the underworld. Luciano's departure marked the close of one chapter and the uncertain start of another. But before he left, there would be a final gathering of his men, his brothers in crime, his allies in power, and the architects of his empire. The names read like a roll call of infamy. Meyer Lansky, the financial wizard who turned nickels and dimes into millions. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. Bugsy Siegel, the visionary gambler with a temper as explosive as his ideas. And Albert Anastasia, the ruthless enforcer who commanded loyalty through fear. They came from every corner of America, men like Longis Willman from New Jersey, Mo Dalitz from Cleveland, Oni Madden and Phil Castile from Louisiana. Even the enigmatic Russell Bufalino, the silent power broker of Pennsylvania, was present alongside his boss, the one and only Joe Barbera. There were farewells shared, winks exchanged, and old debts acknowledged. Phil Castile, the slick operator from Louisiana, greeted Lansky like an old friend and nodded to the boys from Philadelphia. Joe Adonis, Joe Bonanno, Stefano Magaddino, and the Chiandra crime family paid their respects. And in a quiet corner, a young, calculating Carlo Gambino stood by Albert Anastasia, already plotting his ascent to the throne of New York. Gambino was no ordinary guest. By 1946, Luciano already referred to him as an underboss, a title that carried weight even among giants. Gambino's genius lay in his patience. He knew his rise to the top would not come through brute force, but through careful moves and cold precision. All he had to do was wait, maneuver, and eliminate the obstacles in his path. 14 years later, Gambino would make his move, but on that February day, he was still a quiet shadow, observing the men who paved the way for him. This wasn't just a farewell. It was the passing of the torch, a moment frozen in time where power, loyalty, and betrayal converged. These were the men who had turned prohibition into a gold mine, elevating themselves from small-time hoods to kings of a billion-dollar empire that out-earned even U.S. steel. They had corrupted everything America held sacred, the FBI, the CIA, the very political systems meant to protect the nation. But on this day, they weren't criminals. They were family. Men who had saved each other's lives, built empires together, and sworn oaths of unbreakable loyalty. And at the center of it all was Charlie Luciano, the man who had taken them from the streets to the heights of power. As the Laura Keene prepared to set sail, Luciano stood on the deck, gazing out at the city he had conquered and the men who had stood beside him. New York was saying goodbye to its king. But even as Luciano disappeared into the horizon, his legacy remained. An empire of organized crime that would continue to evolve, adapt, and thrive. The world of 1946 was changing. A new era was dawning. But in the shadows, the blueprint Luciano had created would endure, shaping organized crime into a force that would haunt America for decades to come.
We had some of our country's top political leaders there too, and a few who could not come at least sent a representative. I helped elect over 80 important politicians in my time, so the least they could do was drink a glass of champagne and wish me good sailing. Anastasia's boys kept the newspapers guys far enough away so that none of them could get any good pictures, which was my way of doing them a good turn for showing up.
Today, we dive into the story of a man who didn't just live in the shadow of organized crime. He became its architect. Salvatore Charlie Lucky Luciano, the original boss of the infamous Luciano crime family, is the figure who redefined organized crime as we know it. His life wasn't just a story. It was a blueprint for an empire. How did one man go from humble beginnings to the architect of the American underworld? Today, we uncover that tale, drawing heavily from the last testament of Lucky Luciano, a raw, unapologetic account of the life he led. While some details may blur the line between fact and legend, this documentary leans on research, citations, and credible sources to peel back the layers of this enigmatic crime lord. Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano, was born on November 24, 1897, in the rugged Sicilian town of Lercara Friddi. This was no quaint, postcard-perfect village. It was a place forged in fire, its identity tied to the sulfur mines that dominated the region. The mines were hellish, a sweltering inferno where men labored until their backs broke and their spirits crumbled. Temperatures soared so high that workers sometimes toiled naked, their dignity stripped away by the unrelenting heat. And yet, even in this grueling existence, the mob loomed large. The mafia owned everything, every shift, every pickaxe, every breath of sulfur-tainted air. You paid the mafia to open the mine, to work the mine, and often to simply survive in its shadow. It was in this crucible that Luciano's story began. Salvatore was the third child and second son of Antonio and Rosalia Lucania, née Caporelli. From the moment he drew his first breath, Salvatore claimed a special place in his mother's heart. Rosalia doted on him, showering him with an affection that set him apart from his siblings. At the time, Luciano had no idea that the very air he breathed was heavy with the influence of organized crime. To him, this was just life, a brutal, unyielding reality where the mafia's control was woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Luciano's earliest memories of his hometown were hazy, sulfur-laden streets, the ceaseless grind of labor, and the unspoken rules dictated by men whose power came not from elected office, but from fear and blood. This was the world that shaped him, hardened him, and prepared him to seize a destiny far greater than anyone in that small Sicilian town could have imagined.
There was the same kind of gray dust covering everything, and I remembered how it used to get so deep into our clothes that our mothers couldn't wash it out. And there was the same smell. It was the smell of no money, the smell of being hungry all the time.
In his later years, Lucky Luciano often claimed to have forgotten the harsh memories of his Sicilian childhood, the sweat, the sulfur, and the shadow of the mob that loomed over every corner of Lercara Friddi. But when he was deported decades later, unceremoniously sent back to the land of his birth, those memories came flooding back like a knockout punch he never saw coming. The sights, the smells, the grinding weight of life in that rugged town, they hit him with the force of a solid right hand, leaving him momentarily reeling. Like countless Sicilians of their time, Luciano's parents, Antonio and Rosalia, had dreamt of escape, a life beyond the suffocating grip of poverty and the mafia's control. America was the promise whispered in every tired household, the beacon that called to those trapped in the mines and fields of Sicily. Antonio, Luciano's father, would speak of the American states as if they were a mythical land where opportunity grew as plentiful as the crops in fertile fields. His voice carried a hopeful yearning, one that even young Salvatore could sense, though he didn't yet understand its full meaning. For the Lucania family, America wasn't just a destination. It was salvation, a chance to break free from the chains of a life dictated by others. Little did they know, the journey to the promised land would do more than change their circumstances. It would shape Salvatore into one of the most powerful and infamous men in the history of organized crime.
All the time I was growing up, it seemed that all my old man ever talked about was going to America. We had a calendar that come from a steamship company in Palermo, which was where you got on a boat. My old man used to get a new one every year and hang it up on the wall, and Mother used to cross herself every time she walked past it.
By 1906, the jar of savings wasn't full, and Luciano's mother's concern was turning into desperation. She had one dream, one obsession: to get her family to America, especially her favorite son, Salvatore. For her, the promise of America wasn't just streets paved with gold. It was the chance for Salvatore to enroll in the coveted free education system. Back then, that opportunity was priceless, the golden ticket to a future that Italy couldn't offer. In her eyes, if Salvatore grew too old to attend school, the entire journey would be meaningless. The American dream was more than just making money. It was about becoming something. But 1906 came and went, and the family was no closer to their goal. The disappointment cracked the foundation of their hopes, threatening to tear them apart. That's when Salvatore's mother took matters into her own hands. With unshakable resolve, she scraped together the remaining funds, determined to make the impossible happen. Years later, Charlie Luciano would tell the story of a relative, a cousin on his mother's side, who would later reappear in his life in 1946 when his own story came full circle, returning him to his homeland. As Luciano recounted, he remembered it vividly, saying,
"There was a cousin in Lercara Friddi on my mother's side by the name of Rotolo. He had some money from some houses he rented out. My old man was too proud to ask him for a loan, so my mother went to see him in secret and set the whole thing up for Rotolo to hand him a bag of money with some money to spare. My old man didn't find out what my mother had done for more than a year, not until after we was in America. Then he just put the money aside and paid Rotolo back in less than 2 years."
When Salvatore Luciano rose to rule New York, the threads of his early connections faded into the shadows of his empire. By the time Charlie Luciano left Italy at 9 years old, he was a world away from the close-knit Sicilian community that had once held his family together. Yet, when Luciano returned to Italy in 1946, now a man in his 50s, those connections unexpectedly resurfaced. Rotolo, the very man who had helped fund young Salvatore's journey to America, was long gone. But his son stepped forward to welcome Luciano home. When the man approached, Luciano didn't recognize him, a poignant reminder of how far he'd come from his roots. More on that later. Rotolo had been more than a benefactor. He embodied the spirit of the tight-knit community that defined their Sicilian village. It was a bond the Luciano family sorely missed in America. When Charlie returned decades later, it was men like Rotolo's son and others from that community who helped him find his footing on Italian soil, a lifeline he never forgot. For many Italian men deported back to their homeland, the war and mass immigration had severed their ties to family, leaving them stranded and alone. But Luciano, with his storied past and undeniable charisma, found himself embraced by a network that saw him as one of their own. In April 1906, the Luciano family left their village behind, chasing the dream of a better life in America. They arrived in New York, settling below 14th Street to the far east near the river. But what they found was a city that seemed determined to crush them. They were Italians, strangers in a strange land, grappling with customs they didn't understand and a language they couldn't speak. The racism was staggering. Italians were treated as the lowest of the low, paid even less than black workers, a cruel reality that underscored their place in the social hierarchy. For Luciano's family, the trade-off was bitter. They had swapped a familiar poverty for one that was alien and unrelenting. Luciano's father, a bricklayer, earned only slightly more than he had in Italy, but the cost of living in New York consumed nearly every cent. Yet they had come to America with their eyes wide open, knowing hardship was inevitable. They hadn't made the journey for themselves. They had done it for their children, for the promise of opportunity that the free American education system could provide. Charlie would later recall his earliest memory, his mother's voice, full of conviction, speaking about the greatness of American schools. To her, education was the key to everything, the foundation for a life that would transcend their struggles. That hope, that vision, drove her every decision, even as they faced an unforgiving new world.
As far as my mother was concerned, the best thing about America was the school. They were free. Back in Lercara Friddi, we had only Catholic school, and you had to pay to go to them.
Once in America, the Luciano family began the subtle but deliberate transformation into something more palatable to their new world. Giuseppe became Joseph, Francesca became Fanny, Bartolo shortened to Bart, but Salvatore, ever the stubborn and sharp-eyed son, flat out refused to change his name. The thought of ending up with a misstep, like Sally, was enough to keep him resolute. Salvatore would stay Salvatore. He and his siblings were enrolled at Public School 10, a cold and impersonal institution that made no effort to bridge the chasm between them and their classmates. Salvatore, unable to speak a word of English, was banished to the back of the classroom, a silent observer in a sea of unfamiliar faces and foreign words. There was no help, no guidance. The system didn't care whether he sank or swam. It was up to him to claw his way out. Years later, Luciano would speak of those early days with a mix of bitterness and pride. He remembered the isolation, the frustration of being ignored, but also the fire it lit in him. It was there, in that school, that he learned one of his first lessons about survival. No one was going to hand him anything. If he wanted a future, he'd have to figure out how to take it. And take it he did.
It wasn't easy to go to an American school and not know a goddamn word of English. Maybe, in my whole life, that was the worst time I ever experienced the first couple years at Public School 10.
At 9 years old, Charlie Luciano found himself caught in the same whirlwind that engulfed countless children of immigrants. The world around him had shifted so dramatically that it was hard to make sense of it all. Some kids, driven by hunger for knowledge, pushed through the struggles and adapted. Others, overwhelmed by the bewildering new reality, found solace not in books, but on the streets. It was a sink-or-swim environment, and for many the streets were the only lifeboat. Charlie had come from a tough, unforgiving part of Italy, a place where survival demanded maturity far beyond his years. By the time he arrived in America, he was already hardened by life's trials, wise beyond his age. The softness he saw in the American-born children around him baffled and irritated him. To Charlie, they were coddled, sheltered, and naive, a bunch of babies, as he would later sneer. Their innocence was something he neither understood nor respected, a glaring contrast to the ruthless lessons he'd already learned back in Sicily. Charlie's disdain for these kids wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a reflection of the growing gap between his world and theirs. While they fumbled with the basics of childhood, he was already gearing up for the battles that lay ahead. Battles that would define his future in ways they could never comprehend. For Charlie Luciano, there was no time to be soft.
All the other kids in my class were like babies, but they could talk English and I didn't know what the fuck they were saying. Maybe that's why I fought so hard to get out of school, out into the streets where a lot of people spoke Sicilian Italian, and they knew what I was saying and I could understand them.
At school, young Salvatore couldn't help but notice the Jewish children. They stood out, not just for their eagerness to learn, but for their sheer dedication to studying. They read voraciously, devoured books, and seemed to thrive in a world that left him feeling lost and frustrated. At first, it infuriated him. Salvatore was jealous. He wanted to understand what they understood, to grasp the knowledge they soaked up so easily. Adding to his turmoil was the anti-Semitic bias that had been ingrained in him, not just from his household, but from the church itself. Yet the more he watched these children, the more his resentment began to shift. Their determination, their brains, and their ability to rise above their circumstances made an impression on him. Over time, it left a mark that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Unlike many Italians of his generation, this admiration drew him closer to the Jewish community, forging connections that would later prove pivotal. For Charlie Luciano, the Jewish community wasn't just a curiosity, it became a key to a powerful partnership. They had brains, he would say, recognizing their intelligence and value as extraordinary allies. Life in New York, however, was bleak. The Luciano family often found themselves questioning whether they'd made a terrible mistake. At times, the crushing poverty and the alienating culture made their old life in Italy seem almost appealing. But Luciano's father was unyielding. "We are never going back," he insisted, determined to see the family endure the hardships of their new world. His mother, ever the optimist, placed her hopes on the schools and her belief that Salvatore would someday rise above their struggles. When Charlie began to falter at school, her heartbreak was palpable. Her dream of seeing her son thrive in America's great education system started slipping away. For Luciano, this regret lingered long into adulthood. "One of my biggest mistakes," he later admitted, "was learning my English and grammar on the streets." His poor grammar would follow him through life, a flaw he often blamed on the hard lessons of his early years. Looking back, he would say,
I picked up my English from the streets. That's the one thing I regret in my life more than anything else, that my grammar is lousy, and I don't have too many good words and I talk with a New York accent.
At school, Luciano was a mischievous troublemaker, always finding ways to stir the pot. He couldn't stand the English-speaking kids, their fluency a constant reminder of his own struggles. His envy turned to rebellion, and in his frustration, he decided early on that school wasn't for him. He believed he was smarter than the old broads teaching him and convinced himself they had nothing worthwhile to offer. It wasn't long before he left school behind, eager to carve his own path. While Charlie was skipping out on lessons, his parents were grinding away in grueling jobs to keep the family afloat. His father toiled as a bricklayer, and his mother worked endless hours in the city's sewing machine factories. These were brutal, sweat-soaked workplaces, where the air was thick with dust and the looming threat of tuberculosis. This wasn't the dream they had left Italy for. The conditions were hellish, but the family needed the money, and sacrifices had to be made. Charlie would watch his mother work herself to the bone, only to come home and cook, clean, and care for the family. Later, some historians would claim that Luciano's father was abusive to his wife, but nothing could be further from the truth. Luciano always defended his father, describing him as a man who deeply loved his wife and helped whenever he could. They stayed together their entire lives, never divorcing, despite the pressures of their new world. One thing that set the Lucianos apart was their unwavering legitimacy. While Charlie would go on to infamy, his family never dipped their toes into the world of crime. His father, mother, brothers, and sisters stayed on the straight and narrow. They didn't come to America to break the law. They came in search of opportunity, believing that hard work and perseverance would pay off. Years later, Charlie would reflect on those family dinners, where his mother would sit at the table and have quiet conversations with his teachers, hoping to guide her son back onto the right path. For all her efforts, Charlie had already chosen his course, a path far removed from the legitimate, hard-working life his family envisioned.
Some of the mothers of the guys I knew used to work on them sewing machines, and if they got up to get a glass of water or open their mouths to breathe some air, some bastard supervisor could fire them just like that.
The grueling hours and meager pay in the factories meant that union talk was constant among the women. It was all they had: whispers of hope, murmurs of rebellion against the oppressive conditions they endured daily. It was at the dinner table, through his mother and her exhausted friends, that young Salvatore first heard about unions. The idea intrigued him, though not in the way his mother intended. For her, unions were about fairness, dignity, and survival. For Salvatore, the idea planted a different seed entirely: a business opportunity. By 1920, that seed had grown into something far more ambitious. Charlie Luciano and Louis Lepke Buchalter saw the potential in unions, not as a means to protect workers, but as a tool for power and profit. Together, they began organizing the labor rackets, turning the unions into a lucrative enterprise under their control. What had started as whispers around his mother's sewing machine became one of the cornerstones of Luciano's rise to power. A sharp turn from the life of hard work and legitimacy his family had envisioned.
The old broads in school were always hammering away about union. Of course, what they meant was Washington and Lincoln and the whole country. But to us, unions was something that had to do with getting a couple bucks more or a chance to work a few hours less, a chance to organize and become strong. I used to use those ideas in the 20s with Lepke and Tommy L. when I figured out a way to organize the unions and take them over. Later, when the newspapers were calling me the head of the labor rackets in New York, I used to wonder if my old teachers knew what they were, the one that taught me all the principles about organizing people.
While still in school, Salvatore started skipping classes with a group of like-minded troublemakers. What began as harmless bunking off quickly escalated into petty crimes and schemes to make a little money. Salvatore's sharp eye for opportunity revealed itself early. He noticed other Italian and Irish kids bullying the smaller Jewish and Italian boys in the neighborhood. Always one to spot an angle, he stepped in and offered them protection. For a penny a day. The arrangement wasn't just practical for the kids, it was lucrative for young Salvatore. Outside of school, Luciano became a fixture in his community, running errands for local businesses and hustling to make a buck. By the time he entered his teens, he had earned a reputation, not just as a troublemaker, but as a kid who was always in motion, always working some angle. His truancy didn't go unnoticed, and it wasn't long before the authorities started keeping tabs on him. Luciano wasn't just skipping the occasional class. He was practically a full-time truant. Money was all he cared about. School was just an obstacle standing between him and the hustle. But his disregard for the rules caught up with him. On June 25, 1911, Salvatore was finally punished for his chronic truancy and sentenced to 4 months in Brooklyn Truant School. It was his first real taste of discipline from the system, but it wouldn't be the last. For Luciano, the message was clear. The streets offered more opportunities than any classroom ever could.
The first time I got locked up, it was a fog to me. This was a place where you're supposed to learn that it was wrong not to go to school. They worked our asses off just doing nothing. And what a kid learns in that place is how to steal better, or how to pick pockets, all that stuff. When I came out after 4 months, I knew school and me was through.
This stint in Brooklyn Truant School left its mark on young Salvatore Luciano, shaping him in ways the authorities could never have anticipated. Like many kids his age who found themselves locked up for minor offenses, it toughened him up, sharpened his instincts, and added a layer of street smarts that no classroom could offer. Among his peers, it also earned him a kind of respect. He was now a kid who had done time, and that carried weight in the rough neighborhoods he called home. For Luciano, the experience confirmed what he already believed. School wasn't going to teach him anything useful. Why bother trying when the streets offered all the lessons he needed? The punishment didn't steer him away from trouble. It only solidified his belief that his future wasn't in textbooks, but in the hustle. Yet, the experience left a bitter taste. Luciano grew to resent Brooklyn, the place where he'd been confined and humiliated. That distaste stayed with him long after his release. So much so that later in life, when Luciano built his empire, he deliberately avoided conducting any business in Brooklyn. For him, it was a place to leave behind, a symbol of a system he'd outsmart and outgrow.
I also knew I hated Brooklyn. Even later when I was running things in Manhattan, I always managed to stay away from Brooklyn and let the guys over there play their own games without interference.
When Salvatore Luciano walked out of his 4-month stint at Brooklyn Truant School, he wasn't the same kid who had walked in. Tougher, sharper, and more resolved, he carried himself with a new swagger. Waiting for him outside was his father, his face a storm of disappointment and frustration. The walk home was anything but quiet. His father yelled, cursed, and pleaded, trying to hammer sense into his wayward son. School was the only way forward, he insisted. But Luciano had already made his decision. The streets had taught him more in 4 months than school ever could, and he'd been hardened by the harsh lessons of his vacation. For him, there was no going back to sitting in a classroom, staring at a blackboard, and pretending to care. As his father's words rang out, Luciano didn't flinch. He'd chosen his path, and it didn't involve textbooks or teachers. School was behind him now, and there was no turning back.
My old man kept saying the neighborhood's getting worse, that there were gangs of young boys around my age who was knocking off stores, grabbing handbags from old ladies, stuff like that. He said every kid in the neighborhood was growing up to be a crook.
Charlie's father wasn't wrong. His frustrations came from a place of love and sacrifice. He was a hard-working man, like so many other Sicilian immigrants, who had uprooted his family to chase the promise of a better life. Education and honest work were supposed to be the keys to that dream. But Salvatore's rebellion was threatening to derail those hopes. His behavior wasn't just a disappointment, it was a weight dragging the family down. And yet, the elder Luciano faced a grim reality. The community they lived in, proud and resilient as it was also a place of harsh truths. For the younger generation of Sicilians, the hard grafting lifestyle their parents clung to looked less like a dream and more like a dead end. These kids grew up watching their fathers toil 7 days a week for scraps, while their mothers broke their backs in sweatshops. They saw no future in the endless grind. School offered little promise of escape. Racial inequality and language barriers left them behind before they even had a chance. The poverty surrounding them was suffocating. Losing a job could send a family spiraling into starvation or homelessness. Rats and disease were constant companions in the overcrowded tenements, and a single illness could rob a family of its breadwinner, plunging them into destitution. Survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a daily fight, and only the strongest or the luckiest made it through. Yet, these immigrant communities endured because of one thing: their ability to come together. Sicilian neighborhoods were built on a foundation of shared struggle, mutual respect, and an unspoken code of support. But that solidarity had another side. In these same communities, gangs thrived. For kids like Salvatore, the streets offered an alternative to the bleak future of factory work or menial labor. What Luciano saw on the streets wasn't just trouble, it was opportunity. The gangsters who prowled the neighborhood weren't scraping by like his parents. They were commanding respect, money, and power. They were the solution to the crushing weight of poverty and inequality, and for Salvatore they represented a different kind of future. It wasn't just about survival, it was about escaping the grind entirely. The streets became his school, and the gangsters became his inspiration.
When I looked around the neighborhood, I found out that the kids weren't the only crooks. We were surrounded by crooks, and plenty of them was guys who were supposed to be legit, like the landlords and storekeepers and the politician and the police officers on the beat. All of them was stealing from somebody. And we had the real pros, the rich dons from the old country with the big black cars and mustaches to match. We used to make fun of them behind their backs, but our mothers and fathers was scared to death of them. The only thing is, we knew they was rich, and rich was what counted, because the rich got away with anything. One time we got a big prosciutto ham that was sent to us by a cousin in Lercara Friddi. We got all excited because it was the first ever package to come from back home. My old man got a hammer and opened up the crate, and there was this beautiful ham all wrapped up in burlap. We were ready to attack it then, but my mother says no. A prosciutto ham has to be hung for a while so that the air could get it and it wouldn't be too soft. The next day, a guy named Moliari knocked at our door after dinner. It was Tuesday, and he come to collect his dollar. He was a moneylender, the fat bastard, and he specialized in Sicilians. I think my old man borrowed some money from him to buy my sister a new bed, and he was about 3 or 4 weeks behind on the payment. So Moliari came up with 3 or 4 guys to come and take the bed. When he got a look at the ham hanging in the kitchen, the son of a bitch took it like it belonged to him and started to walk out. When he got to the door, he said to my mother something like, "I'll take this. You don't want your girls sleeping on the floor."
Now Charlie Luciano was all in. He'd made his choice, to hustle, to scheme, to carve out a life on the streets. He embraced the life of a hoodlum with a confidence that drew admiration from those around him. Among his younger contemporaries, he was something of a legend in the making. With just 5 or 6 kids in his crew, Charlie began marauding through the Lower East Side, a small but determined force intent on making their mark. Their operations started with small, petty robberies, minor hold-ups, just enough to pocket some cash without drawing too much heat. They stashed their earnings wherever they could, improvising with tin cans hidden in cabinets or other makeshift spots that only they knew about. But living at home came with its challenges. Flashy purchases would raise suspicions from parents who would be quick to question where the money came from. Charlie, always thinking ahead, had a solution. He allowed 2 crew members with legitimate jobs to join the fold, a move that provided a cover story if anyone ever got caught with cash that couldn't be explained. But what set Charlie apart wasn't just his cunning, it was his leadership. While most street gangs operated on chaos and greed, Charlie introduced something radical: structure. Instead of letting each member hoard their take, he created a common pool where all proceeds from their illicit activities were deposited. At regular meetings, Charlie and his crew would decide together how the money would be spent. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about control. By pooling their resources, Charlie ensured loyalty and unity among his crew. Everyone felt like they had a stake, and no one was left out. It was a glimpse of the sharp mind and strategic thinking that would later catapult him from petty crime to the top of the underworld. Even in those early days, Charlie Luciano wasn't just another street thug. He was already playing a bigger game.
I had a rule that every member had to have a job, as a kind of front so he can explain how come he could buy new things. I let 2 Irish kids join because they had jobs, and besides, they were nice fellows. One of them was a red-headed guy by the name of Willie Mulvaney, whose old man was a cop up in the Bronx. One time, Willie wanted a new pair of pants. He was still wearing his knickers because he was so little. So, we had a regular meet, and his request was turned down flat. Well, this dumbhead Willie Mulvaney takes the money anyway and buys the pants and wears them home. His old man, Mulvaney the cop, kept a book on every penny his son earned. When he found out that Mulvaney didn't steal the pants from the store but actually paid for them, the shit hit the fan. There were 15 kids in my gang in that time, and we all got hauled to the police station on 14th Street. It was like a circus. Our mothers and fathers, all our relatives were trying to talk at the same time, trying to explain to the sergeant that we were good boys who wouldn't do anything wrong. Everybody, that is, but my old man. He beat the crap out of me right there in the police station.
Luciano's success on the streets was becoming a problem. It was making him too visible. His growing wealth was starting to outshine his humble community, and he knew it was time to make a move. The Lower East Side, with its tightly knit Sicilian enclaves and watchful eyes, wasn't the place to expand his ambitions. Luciano was sharp enough to know that older Italian criminal societies, brought over from the old country, operated in the shadows around him. To avoid stepping on any toes, he started looking beyond his own backyard. North of 14th Street was the rest of Manhattan, a vast expanse teeming with opportunity. While East Harlem had its own struggling Sicilian ghetto, with entrenched gangs controlling their territories, Charlie set his sights elsewhere. He began exploring the middle and upper parts of the island, studying how the people lived and what they owned. What he saw sparked a new kind of ambition. The big houses, manicured gardens, and glittering signs of wealth became a symbol of something greater for Luciano. He wasn't just chasing survival anymore. He was chasing the good life. The material possessions and comforts of the wealthy became his new inspiration. This move north wasn't just physical, it was strategic. It placed Luciano in the orbit of new players, crooks and gangsters operating in different circles. And it was during this transition that he crossed paths with someone who would alter the course of his life and organized crime itself, Francesco Castiglia, better known as Frank Costello. How they met remains unclear. Costello himself never went into detail, only hinting that they shared mutual business interests and crossed paths through a man named Arnold Rothstein. But Luciano would later claim that he met Costello in his teenage years. What's certain is that their meeting marked the start of a partnership that would shape the criminal underworld. Frank Costello, born in Italy in 1891, had arrived in America in 1896, about a decade before Luciano. By the time Luciano was carving his name into the Lower East Side, Costello, 6 years his senior, was already moving through the ranks of East Harlem. Experience gave him an edge, allowing him to navigate circles that were still out of reach for Luciano. Costello grew up in the tough, Irish-dominated neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Morningside, where being an Italian who didn't speak English made him a target of scorn. Like Luciano, Costello understood the struggles of Italian immigrants, but he also faced the sharp tensions between the Italian and Irish communities. These rivalries often erupted into violent clashes, with both groups vying for dominance in their neighborhoods. Costello and his associates knew they needed young, ambitious men for these fights, men who understood the rules of the streets. When Costello and Luciano met, they quickly found common ground. Both were hungry, both were tough, and both saw petty crime as the first step to something much bigger. That shared ambition, combined with their complementary skills, forged a bond that would eventually make them two of the most powerful men in organized crime. But in these early days, it was just the beginning, a partnership born in the chaos of the streets.
It happened at a movie theater in Times Square. I think it was called the Victoria. It was on a Saturday night and some of my guys and me went uptown to see what the action was. We liked to go to the movies because them silent pictures had titles and they helped us learn English. Of course, we always sat on the balcony. It was cheaper. Besides, we could throw stuff down at the orchestra and raise all kinds of hell. This night, the manager threw us out at the same time he threw out some other guys who was sitting on the other side of the balcony. One of the guys was a little older than us, and he had an outfit called the 104th Street Gang. We got together, and it turns out that this older guy was not from Sicily. He was a Calabrian from Cosenso. His name was Francesco Castiglia. Later on, he got famous under the name Frank Costello.
Frank Costello's story began in the same shadowy corners of struggle and survival as Charlie Luciano's. His family knew poverty so profound that his father, despite his relentless labor, had little to show for it. Young Frank faced a grim reality so unbearable that instead of staying home to witness his family's misery, he would wander the streets until sunrise. Those early years etched a vow deep within him, a vow never to be poor, never to have children to suffer as he did, and never to go without. Poverty left its mark, but it also ignited a fire in him. When Costello and Luciano eventually crossed paths, it wasn't just a meeting. It was the collision of two minds destined to change the underworld. Costello's rise was meteoric. His influence was so vast that when J. Edgar Hoover sought to establish backdoor channels between the FBI and the mob, he reached out to only one man: Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of Organized Crime. Costello's word was ironclad, his reputation for integrity so solid that even the upper echelons of legitimate society, judges, politicians, and socialites, trusted him. His Manhattan apartment became a hub for the country's elite, a place where the lines between power and corruption blurred over lavish dinners and fine wine. Costello's charm extended beyond the mob's usual circles. One evening, an Indian socialite he had met at a cafe invited him to a high society dinner party. She couldn't resist his magnetic personality and asked him to attend, but when she told her guests who was coming, the room erupted. One particularly irate Wall Street broker threatened to leave if Costello showed up. Undeterred, the hostess greeted Costello at the door, nervously explaining the chilly reception. Costello merely smiled and asked, "Who gave the coldest reception?" When she pointed out the broker, Costello approached the man with the grace of a statesman. "What do you do for a living?" he asked warmly. "I work on Wall Street," the man replied tersely. Costello's grin widened. "Well then, we're in the same business. We both gamble with other people's money." The tension dissolved in laughter, and by the end of the night, the broker became one of Costello's closest friends, even managing his investments. Costello's brilliance wasn't just in winning over enemies, it was in understanding what people wanted most. "Politicians," he once told Luciano, "are the greediest men in America. No amount of fame, money, or whores will ever satisfy them." It was this insight that made Costello a master of corruption, a man who could bend the world to his will. Luciano, in turn, saw in Costello a mentor of sorts. After their early conversations, Luciano admitted he realized for the first time that intelligence wasn't exclusive to the Jewish mobsters he admired. Together, they forged an unbreakable partnership, rooted in a shared vision. They understood that, united, they could achieve far more than either could alone. Frank Costello went on to become a titan of organized crime, a man who operated in the shadows, but commanded the respect of the nation's most powerful. His rise wasn't just about wealth or influence. It was about mastering the game and redefining its rules.
The first time I heard him talk, I had to lean over to hear him because his voice was very husky, like he had a cold. A lot of Italian kids talk like that. Their mothers wanted the best for them, and they thought the best was to get their tonsils and adenoids out the first time the kid's nose started to run. A lot of times, the doctor wasn't so good, or the knife slipped, and the kid always talked like he had a permanent sore throat after that. That's what happened to Frank.
Even as a teenager, Frank Costello had a reputation that preceded him. A tough, no-nonsense enforcer with a .38 always within reach. He carried himself with the kind of swagger that only came from surviving the hard streets of New York, though that pistol would later become a symbol of regret for him. It was 1914, and the city was a patchwork of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made if you were bold or ruthless enough to seize them. At 17, Charlie Luciano was already carving out his place in this world. He wasn't bringing in big money yet, just small-time profits from street-level rackets. Whatever earnings his crew made went into a communal pot, divided only after the bribes and expenses were paid. It was a system as old as the streets, And for now, it worked. To keep up appearances, Luciano held a legitimate job as an errand boy, earning $6 a week, $1 more than the average kid his age. That extra dollar wasn't just luck. It was a testament to his knack for building relationships. His employer, Mr. Goodman, a Jewish shopkeeper on West 24th Street, had taken a liking to the sharp and streetwise Luciano. That connection gave Luciano a foothold in two worlds: the respectable one he pretended to belong to, and the dark, dangerous one he was destined to dominate.
It's a little hard to explain that $1 a week more could make such a difference, but that was around 1914, and a dollar was a fortune. With my guys, that extra buck made me important, and I kind of liked the feeling.
Max Goodman was more than just a boss to young Salvatore Luciano. He was a mentor, almost a father figure. A Jewish businessman with a kind heart, Goodman treated Luciano as one of his own. He trusted the boy completely, inviting him home for meals, sharing stories, and teaching him about Jewish culture. It was Goodman's kindness and openness that chipped away at the anti-Semitism Luciano had absorbed from the Italian community. Under Goodman's guidance, Luciano began to see the world differently, understanding a culture that had once seemed foreign to him. Goodman admired Luciano's drive, his hunger to rise above his station, his charm, his ambition that bordered on naivete. Luciano had an almost disarming eagerness to please, a thirst for knowledge, and a work ethic that set him apart. At times he worked so selflessly, it seemed as if he forgot he was hustling for himself. And Goodman, like so many others who would cross Luciano's path, couldn't help but like him for it. Through Goodman, Luciano got a glimpse of what life without poverty might look like. Jewish culture, once alien, became familiar, almost comforting. But despite his affection for Goodman, the job was a facade, a way to show he had legitimate income. The truth was, Luciano's real life was on the streets. That's where he planned heists, coordinated hold-ups, and ran jobs with his crew. It wasn't long before the streets called to him, louder than Goodman's steady guidance. One day, as he was navigating his double life, Luciano spotted someone who instantly captured his attention, a man in a flashy car, well-dressed and carrying an aura of power. He was George Scanlon, a known figure in the narcotics trade, and someone the neighborhood whispered about. For weeks, Luciano watched him, studying his every move, absorbing what he could from afar. This was the kind of man he wanted to be. Someday, Luciano thought, their paths would cross, and he'd make sure Scanlon noticed him. The streets had their own hierarchy, and Luciano was determined to climb it.
You couldn't miss George Scanlon. He drove a big limousine and parked wherever he wanted next, to fire hydrants even on the sidewalk, and nobody bothered him. He wore sharp clothes with wide stripes, and he had a diamond ring on his pinky finger. He smelled like the United States Mint.
One day, Salvatore Luciano saw his chance and took it. Spotting George Scanlon's flashy car parked nearby, he seized a rag and started cleaning it with the care of a craftsman. Scanlon, watching the kid work, was impressed. When Salvatore finished, Scanlon tossed him a quarter as a tip, but instead of pocketing it, Salvatore tossed it back, saying, "Keep it. I just need a minute of your time." For that brief golden moment, Salvatore had the full attention of one of the most powerful players in the narcotics trade. He wasted no time. Salvatore told Scanlon about his legitimate front, his job as a delivery boy for Max Goodman's respectable business, and pitched an idea. He could use the front to deliver heroin discreetly and efficiently. "If I can deliver hats," he said with a sly grin, "I can deliver other things." Scanlon, intrigued by the young man's audacity, agreed to give him a shot. It wasn't long before Salvatore was deep into the drug game, learning its ins and outs with a cold detachment. He didn't care about the destruction heroin caused. For him, it was about the money. And money he made. more than anyone else in his crew. His earnings weren't fixed. Instead, he pocketed wads of crisp 20s and 10s. Among his comrades, Salvatore was seen as a maverick, the one who worked harder, earned more, and carried himself with a confidence that outshined the rest. But success breeds enemies. Rumors swirled that one of his crew, jealous of Salvatore's growing respect and wealth, had ratted him out. By the early hours of June 1916, federal agents were watching his every move. On June 26th, they made their move. Salvatore, who often frequented a pool room on East 14th Street, a known hangout for addicts and pushers, was arrested just outside its doors. The hats he was delivering from Goodman's shop, packed with heroin. In court, Salvatore pleaded guilty. The sentence, 1 year behind bars. His mother wept uncontrollably, devastated by what her son had become. His father didn't even show up, too ashamed to face the disgrace. On Christmas Day 1916, the gates of Hampton Farms prison opened, and Salvatore began serving his time. Prison was a wake-up call. Cut off from his crew and the streets, Salvatore knew he had to find a way to survive, to work the system from the inside while planning his return to power. His first visitor was none other than Max Goodman, the very man whose business he had used as a front, tarnishing its reputation. Despite the betrayal, Goodman still cared for the boy he once treated like a son. But this wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. Max looked at Salvatore with a mixture of disappointment and pain. "Why did you do this to me?" he asked. "I treated you like family." Salvatore had no real answer. Finally he muttered, "I was hungry for money." Goodman shook his head. "Money isn't the whole world." "But when you're dirt poor," Salvatore replied, "it feels like it is." Goodman's voice softened. "If you ever needed money, all you had to do was come to me." But Salvatore knew the truth. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about living large. Flashy suits, a taste of luxury, the thrill of being somebody. Before the visit ended, Goodman tried to reach the boy he once knew. "Salvatore," he began, but Luciano cut him off. "My name's Charlie now," he said firmly. It was more than a name change. It was a declaration of reinvention, a step toward becoming the man he envisioned. Goodman nodded. "All right, Charlie. If that's who you are now, that's what I'll call you. But promise me this. Keep your head down in here. Do what they tell you. Behave yourself, and I'll work the system on the outside while you do your part on the inside." Luciano listened, and for one of the few times in his life, tears welled in his eyes. He promised Goodman he'd do his best. True to his word, Goodman launched a relentless campaign to secure Luciano's release, writing letters and making personal visits to parole officials. He even promised to give Luciano his old job back. For 6 months, Goodman fought for him. But Charlie didn't just sit idly. Inside, he played the game, earning trust, keeping his head low, and proving he wasn't a troublemaker. Together, their efforts paid off. 6 months later, Charlie Luciano walked free, a little older, a little wiser, and more determined than ever to reclaim his place on the streets.
I scrubbed floors, I scrubbed walls, I cleaned out latrines, I scoured pots and pans. They had guards watching all of us young guys, and we got the worst kind of work. They stood over us with rubber hoses, and there was hardly a day where I didn't get a few solid whacks across the back. I had a bucket, some rags, and a heavy brush and some kind of cleaning liquid with lye in it. I had to get on my hands and knees and scrub the floors. When I'd get up at the end of the day, my knees were raw and bleeding. They would never get the chance to heal. Sometimes I'll make knee pads for my knees with a few rags, but when the guards saw what I was doing, they'd beat the shit out of me. Every single night I was too tired to eat, and even when I was starved, the food, it was so terrible that it was almost impossible to swallow. The worst part of them 6 months was that I didn't have no privacy, that I could never be alone. I hated the idea that there was no place where you could take a crap without 50 million guys watching you. How can a human being wipe his ass with all those guys watching?
When Charlie Luciano reflected on his past, especially his time in jail, there was one comparison he'd always make, a connection to a character from a movie he once saw. That character was Oliver Twist. Luciano would speak about it with a wry smile, finding an odd kinship with the scrappy, street-smart orphan navigating a world stacked against him. Like Oliver, Charlie was a survivor, someone who learned early on how to adapt, charm, and hustle to stay ahead. Both had been shaped by hardship. Both had walked the line between innocence and corruption, and both knew how to turn misfortune into opportunity. For Luciano, Oliver Twist wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of his own rise from the slums to power. A reminder that even the humblest beginnings could forge a legend.
I seen a movie called Oliver Twist. It was written by some English guy by the name Charles Dickens, and the young kid in that picture reminded me of myself, because they used to knock this little bastard around in the picture the way
Christmas
they did to me at
1916,
Hampton Farms.
The gates of Hampton Farms swung open, and Charlie Luciano stepped into the cold air of freedom. His family, hopeful and determined, urged him to turn over a new leaf. His siblings pleaded with him to leave the streets behind and walk the straight and narrow path. For a time, he tried. He worked legitimate jobs, doing his best to scrape together an honest living. But those efforts felt futile. The meager wages he earned were nothing more than crumbs, barely enough to survive, let alone transform his family's fortunes. Every time he looked at the glittering mansions of Manhattan, the sprawling homes of the wealthy, he realized the harsh truth. Honest work would never get him there. The dream of lifting his family out of poverty or living in those grand houses remained just that, a dream. Charlie's ambition couldn't be contained by small paychecks and menial jobs. He saw the wealth and power others had, and he knew he wanted his share. The streets had shown him a way before, and they would again. If he were going to rise, it wouldn't be through breaking his back for pennies. It would be on his own terms, no matter what it took.
It seemed like everybody in my family, even my siblings, came charging at me to reform, to go back to work for Goodman. I knew they was ashamed of me in front of all their Sicilian friends that everybody called me the bad one.
When his mother discovered he had changed his name from Salvatore to Charlie, it was like a dagger to her heart. To her, it wasn't just a name. It was their heritage, their identity, and the last connection to the life they'd left behind in Sicily. Changing it felt like a betrayal, a rejection of everything she had sacrificed for her family to build a new life in America. She confronted him, her voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "Salvatore," she said, refusing to acknowledge the name he had chosen for himself. "Do you think you can just erase who you are, who we are?" Charlie didn't flinch. He knew this moment would come. "Ma," he said quietly, "I didn't change who I am. I changed who I have to be. In this country, Charlie opens doors that Salvatore never will." But his words did little to comfort her. To her, it wasn't just about survival or opportunity. It was about pride, about staying true to their roots, no matter how hard life got. For days, she barely spoke to him, her disapproval hanging heavy in the air. For Charlie, the name change was a step forward, a way to shed the old world and fully embrace the new. For his mother, it was a step too far, a painful reminder that her son was slipping further and further from the boy she once knew.
And you might think I committed murder because I changed my name to Charlie. My mother started to tell me about all the people in my family named Salvatore. In fact, she never gave up on calling me Sal, and my father, when I told him, he just spat on the floor.
And when it came to having a normal 9 to 5 and having a decent legal job, Charlie's thoughts were as he describes.
I began to realize that what I'd promised to Goodman would make me nothing but a crumb. I made up my mind that if I had to wind up a crumb, I'd rather be dead.
Charlie Luciano's view of the world was sharp, unsentimental, and brutally honest. Whenever people criticized his life of crime or the misdeeds tied to his name, he would often say, "Crumbs." That was what he called the men and women who worked themselves to the bone for next to nothing. Italian, Irish, Jewish laborers who broke their backs day after day, only to end up with empty pockets and no future. To Charlie, these crumbs were trapped, destined for nothing better because they played by the rules of a system designed to keep them down. Charlie was different. He believed the only way to escape that grind was to bend or break the rules entirely. The social ladder wasn't built for men like him to climb, so he chose to rewrite the game. By 19, his services were in high demand among his criminal peers. They constantly pulled at him to rejoin their heists, offering riches and recognition on the streets. But back at home, his siblings still clung to hope that Charlie would change course, abandon crime, and live a respectable life. Their hopes, however, were destined to be crushed. The breaking point came one day after a jewelry store robbery near the family home. Charlie's father found a golden belt buckle, its glint impossible to ignore. Confronting his son, his father demanded an explanation. Charlie, with no fear in his heart and no remorse in his voice, admitted the truth. "I wanted it," he said flatly. "So I took it." The admission sparked an explosive argument. His father, furious at the brazen defiance, lashed out, striking Charlie with a belt in a fit of rage. The blow left a scar on his face. A scar not from the streets, but from his own father. The fight escalated. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back, and Charlie's fate within his family was sealed. His father demanded he leave, throwing him out of the house. "So long, Mom," Charlie said as he walked out the door, his tone as cold as the life he was walking into. At 19, Charlie Luciano left his family behind and moved into a cold water flat in the West 20s. His roommate was a friend, Frankie Coppola, but this wasn't just a change of address. It was a declaration of independence. The boy who had tried to straddle the line between family loyalty and street ambition was gone. In his place stood Charlie Luciano, a young man fully committed to the life of a gangster, unashamed and unapologetic. The streets were now his only home, and there was no turning back.
In the beginning, it was like a palace to us because it was our joint, the first time we lived away from home. The biggest thing for us was that now we had a place to bring broads, and we didn't have to do those quickies in the whorehouses. Frankie and I would toss a coin to use the place for the night while the other guy went for a walk. Sometimes we didn't stay out long enough and we walk in on each other.
At a young age, he wasn't after love. He was more focused on the money.
I wasn't the kind of guy who was looking for romance. There were too many things I wanted to do.
Charlie Luciano's rise wasn't without its setbacks. The streets were a brutal teacher, and the lessons came hard and fast. Mistakes were made, not just by him, but by his crew. They were sloppy, inexperienced, and prone to errors that put them all at risk. For Charlie, this was becoming a problem. Progress felt too slow, and in a world where hesitation could get you killed or locked up, slow wasn't an option. Charlie realized something critical. If he wanted to climb higher, he needed to surround himself with better people. His current associates lacked the discipline, vision, and intelligence necessary to succeed on a grander scale. They were holding him back, and Charlie wasn't the type to settle for mediocrity. To truly rise, he needed to align himself with sharper minds, peers his own age, who were smarter, more ambitious, and shared his hunger for power. People who understood that the streets weren't just about muscle and guts, but about strategy, finesse, and long-term thinking. Charlie was done playing small time. It was time to build alliances with those who could help him achieve the vision he carried in his mind. A future where he wasn't just a player in the game, but the one running it.
The thing that made me realize that I was still going nowhere Happened one night when our gang did a job down at the Battery. One of the guys, Willie Tiapi, had cased a warehouse near the fish market where the whole shipload of canned anchovies came in. Italians love anchovies, and these was the best quality. We set the whole thing up. We had a wholesaler who was willing to fence the stuff at half price, which would have meant over $2,000 for us. The only thing, Willie didn't case the job too good. He didn't know they had 2 night watchmen on weekends instead of 1. Frankie Coppola got caught. The rest of us got away. It was Frankie's first offense, so he got off with the prohibition on condition that he lived with his folks and go back to school. That's what he did. He learned how to be a cabinet maker and he stayed straight.
Some men fell away, unable to endure the grind or the pressure. Others stayed loyal, sticking it out with Charlie Luciano as the streets grew tougher and the jobs scarcer. For a gang, downtime meant no money, and for men who lived on the edge, poverty hit hard. But Charlie's troubles weren't confined to the streets. His family, especially his mother and father, never gave up trying to pull him back from his criminal path. His siblings begged him to change his ways, and even Max Goodman made his attempts to steer him straight. It was all in vain. Charlie belonged to the streets now, and he was determined to make something of himself no matter the cost. One evening, after weeks of separation, Charlie returned home for dinner. He couldn't turn his back on his mother and siblings entirely. He was Sicilian after all. But what started as a family gathering soon turned into an explosive confrontation. Charlie arrived dressed to the nines, a brand new suit, shiny shoes, and a tie so sharp it could cut glass. It was the kind of outfit that screamed money, power, and a life his family despised. His mother, much like Karen in Goodfellas, opened the door to find her son transformed. No longer the boy she raised, but a man immersed in the underworld. The dinner was a disaster from the start. His mother pleaded with him to leave crime behind, and Charlie, instead of showing respect, committed what Sicilians considered a mortal sin. He told her to shut up. His father, already simmering with anger, exploded. Sitting across from his son, he picked up Charlie's bowl of spaghetti and hurled it across the table, splattering the rich sauce all over that expensive suit. Charlie was livid. He wanted to hit his father, wanted it more than anything, but in Sicilian culture, striking your father was unthinkable. Instead, he locked eyes with him, his fury boiling just beneath the surface. Slowly, Charlie stood, wiped the spaghetti from his suit, and stormed out. "So long, Mum," he muttered, slamming the door behind him. From that moment on, Charlie only returned home when he knew his father wasn't there. For weeks, he carried a reminder of that night, stubborn stains on his suit that wouldn't come out. By then, Charlie had moved into his own cold water flat in the West 20s, sharing it with his friend Frankie Coppola. It gave him freedom, a place to come and go as he pleased. But the streets weren't easy. Some of his crews were facing setbacks, including a young Frank Costello. Known then as Frank Castiglia, Costello had already been arrested multiple times for assault and robbery. In 1916, the law finally caught up with him for gun possession. The judge had letters from neighbors, all claiming Costello always carried a weapon. That reputation earned him a 1-year sentence, a lesson Frank would never forget. Years later, he reflected, carrying a gun is like carrying a sign that says, "I'm a criminal, arrest me." After that, I swore I'd never pack a gun again, and I never did. By 1916, Costello was out of prison and back in business. It was the same year Luciano walked free after serving time for narcotics possession. The two reconnected, but another name was about to enter the picture. A young man who would change everything. Meyer Lansky. Meyer was already making waves in the streets, always shadowed by a boy 4 years younger, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Even as a teenager, Benny was striking, tall, handsome, and fearless. Charlie would later say, everybody loved Benny. But Benny's charm masked a ferocious temper. One day, during a street game gone wrong, a fight broke out, and the police whistles sounded in the distance. In the chaos, Benny pulled a gun, ready to shoot, oblivious to the oncoming police. But another kid, older and calmer, slapped the weapon out of his hand and dragged him away. Benny was furious at losing his money and his gun. But that kid, the one who saved him, was Meyer Lansky. From that moment, a bond was forged. Meyer took Benny under his wing, and together they became a force. Charlie's crew began to take shape. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, and Siegel, a combination so powerful that Charlie would later call them the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. They were young, ambitious, and unstoppable. Meyer was the brains, a strategist whose mind for numbers dazzled even Costello. Frank would later admit, "When it came to math, Meyer could blitz me any day. He did all the complicated thinking for Charlie." Meyer knew the days of bootlegging wouldn't last forever and began planning for the future, perfecting gambling operations that would position the Jewish and Italian mafias at the center of a new era of crime. Meyer earned respect across the underworld. Lucchese admired him, Bufalino sought his advice, and even the Chicago outfit under Tony Accardo held him in high regard. But Meyer also knew his limits. He avoided tangling with Santo Trafficante, a man even he feared. While Carlos Marcello tolerated Jewish mobsters, he didn't like them. Still, Meyer's reputation was untouchable. The Bug and Meyer gang, as they became known, specialized in transporting liquor during Prohibition. They were efficient, ruthless, and loyal. One infamous story about Siegel showcased his fearlessness. During a bootlegging run, their car was ambushed. The flare gun used to signal backup had fallen out of the vehicle. Siegel, just 18 at the time, jumped from the car and dove into the bushes, firing at the attackers. He killed 3 men and sent the rest scattering. Then, under heavy fire, he retrieved the flare gun, signaling for help while eliminating the remaining shooters. By the time reinforcements arrived, all they saw was Siegel standing in the glow of car lights, a smoking Tommy gun in one hand, a cigarette in the other. The Italians with him cowered behind him, visibly shaken. It was in those moments that Charlie Luciano saw the potential of his crew. "I loved Benny," he'd later say. "We all loved Benny." Together, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, and Siegel weren't just making a name for themselves. They were rewriting the rules of organized crime. The streets of New York were their proving ground, and they were just getting started.
I first saw Lansky and Siegel long before I left home, when I used to grab pennies from the little Jewish kids for protection. I remember when I made Lansky the usual proposition. I was about a head taller than this midget, but he looked up at me without blinking an eye, with nothing but guts showing in his face, and he said, "Fuck you." Well, I started to laugh and patted him on the shoulder and said, "Okay, you got your protection for free." He just pulled away and yelled, "Shove your protection up your ass, I don't need it." Believe me, I found out he didn't need it. Next to Benny Siegel, Meyer Lansky was the toughest guy, pound for pound, I ever knew in my whole life, and that takes in Albert Anastasia or any of them hoodlums in Brooklyn, or anybody can think of.
That's one hell of a compliment coming from Lucky Luciano himself. To say that someone like Meyer Lansky earned Luciano's admiration is no small feat. It's a testament to just how sharp and resourceful Meyer was, even in his early years. Short in stature but towering in influence, Lansky could maneuver through the labyrinth of organized crime like no one else. Known as the Jewish Don, Meyer Lansky was, in my opinion, one of the most significant figures in the history of organized crime. His reputation was unparalleled, and his impact rippled through decades of the mafia's rise. More books have been written about Lansky than any other Prohibition-era gangster, and for good reason. A mathematical genius and Luciano's personal adding machine, Lansky mastered the art of finances in a world built on muscle and intimidation. Yet much of what's said about him, his immense wealth, his power, and most intriguingly, his knowledge of the financial dealings of the world's most powerful mobsters, has been clouded by myth and exaggeration. Meyer Lansky wasn't just a numbers guy, he was the numbers guy. He didn't just manage his own finances, he managed the books for the biggest names in organized crime. That trust didn't come easily. It was forged in loyalty and proven when Luciano himself handed over control of his finances to Lansky before heading to Dannemora prison. When Luciano was released in 1946, Lansky returned every dollar he hadn't spent, though there wasn't much left after paying off people like Thomas Dewey, the very prosecutor who sent Luciano away, and footing astronomical legal fees. But to Luciano, the money didn't matter, his freedom did. That moment cemented Lansky's reputation among the Italian mobsters. Meyer Lansky wasn't just a partner, he was a man to be trusted, someone who never skimmed a cent. This trust was rare in a world where betrayal was as common as a card game, and it elevated Lansky to an unparalleled position within the mafia's inner circles. A common misconception is that Luciano and Lansky were as close as brothers. They were close, yes, but Lansky's truest friendships lay elsewhere. His closest allies included Vincent "Jimmy Blue Eyes" Arlo and the enigmatic Russell Bufalino, as well as Hollywood's own George Raft. When Lansky's son Buddy was born with severe disabilities, it was Jimmy Blue Eyes who joined Meyer for a week-long drinking binge to drown the sorrow. Their bond wasn't built on crime alone, but on deep personal loyalty. Lansky was a rare combination of ruthless pragmatism, relentless intelligence, and unmatched cunning. He was, as Luciano would later describe him, a computer before there were computers. He didn't just bring his brilliance to the table. He assembled a team of thinkers, innovators, and stone-cold killers who shaped organized crime into an empire. This partnership with Luciano became one of the most pivotal alliances in mafia history. With Lansky handling the finances and Luciano orchestrating the unions and operations, they created a powerhouse that dominated the underworld. It made them multi-millionaires at their peak, a feat few could rival in their day. Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel also played a critical role in shaping the mafia's future. It was Siegel who saw the untapped potential in the Nevada desert, a barren wasteland waiting to become a gold mine. His vision for Las Vegas would transform organized crime into a modern empire, blending vice with glitz and glamour in a way no one had done before. Lansky's legacy goes beyond his numbers and influence. He represented a bridge between worlds, the Italian mafia, the Jewish syndicates, and even legitimate business ventures. What he brought to the mafia wasn't just intelligence, it was trust, loyalty, and an unwavering focus on the bigger picture. Together, Luciano, Lansky, and their circle didn't just rise to power, they rewrote the rules of the game, leaving a legacy that would echo for generations.
We were like analyzers. We didn't hustle ourselves into a decision before we had a chance to think it out. Siegel was just the opposite, and I guess that's what made him good for us, because he would make his move on sheer guts and impulse.
Charlie Luciano was no longer just another kid on the streets. He was carving out his place in the underworld, building something bigger than anyone could have imagined. He had settled into his own patch, staking his claim, and surrounded himself with a crew brimming with the youth, hunger, and raw talent. This wasn't just a gang, it was the foundation of an empire. And now, the pieces were falling into place. Frank Costello, a master of corruption, could charm or strong-arm anyone into his pocket. Politicians, cops, judges, you name it. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the financial genius who would go on to revolutionize money laundering and financial management, creating innovative systems that Charlie himself could never have dreamed of. Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel brought a fearless energy, a man bold enough to take on any job, anywhere, with a dangerous charm that turned heads and terrified rivals. And at the center of it all stood Charlie Luciano, the man with the vision to break the old mafia rules and bring together Italians, Jews, and Irish hoodlums under one banner. This wasn't just unheard of, It was revolutionary. By bridging communities that traditionally stayed in their own lanes, Charlie was setting himself up for something far greater. These alliances would serve him well in the years to come, laying the groundwork for connections in other states and giving him an understanding of what made each community tick. He didn't just see diversity as an advantage, he saw it as a weapon. Looking back on those days, Luciano would speak with pride about the unity they forged. At that moment, he'd say, the four of us together, me, Frank, Maya, and Benny, we had something nobody else had. We weren't just a gang. We were the future.
The best team that ever got put together. We knew our jobs better than any other guys on the street. We were like the four horsemen of Notre Dame, except what would two Jewish guys be doing at Notre Dame?
The story of how Frank Castilla became Frank Costello is one of those underworld legends that blurs the line between calculated genius and street-level improvisation. It happened during one of their earliest jobs together, a warehouse robbery that would go down as more than just a heist. It would change the course of Costello's identity and cement his place in history. It was sometime before 1914, long before Frank walked down the aisle and signed his marriage papers under the name Costello. By then, the name had already stuck, but its origins were the result of an unlikely moment on the streets. Charlie Luciano would later recount the night when it all happened, a conversation between him, Frank, Maya Lansky, and Benny Siegel while they were about to pull off a robbery. The four of them were sitting in a beat-up car outside a factory, planning to jack a load of goods. The air was tense, but crackling with the kind of energy only young, ambitious criminals could bring. Maya, always the thinker, turned to Frank with an unexpected question.
Why should the Jews, Bugsy and me, always go first and take all the chances? Then everything gets split down the middle. We've got two Italians, so why don't you two take the same chances?
What do you mean, two Italians? We're one Wop, one Mick, and two Jews, just like in the neighborhood. Mayor just stared at me.
What are you talking about? One Wop and one Mick? Where's the Mick?
He's Irish. You know, Frank Costello. That's how Frank Costello got his name. I remember we told this story so many times later on that lots of guys would sometimes call Costello, "Hey Irish." And of course, when we got up to our ears in New York politics, it didn't hurt at all that we had an Italian guy with us with an Irish name like Costello.
The team was nearly complete, and the foundation for something far greater was being laid. Charlie Luciano, Maya Lansky, and Frank Costello were learning from their mistakes, refining their techniques, and turning their small-time heists into well-oiled operations. Each job, every theft, stick-up, and robbery got bigger, smarter, and more lucrative. By 1917, leading into 1918, the three of them were no longer just a group of ambitious street kids. They were evolving into a crew with a shared vision. What united them wasn't just crime. It was the idea of building something lasting, something bigger than the individual scores. Each man brought a unique strength to the table. Charlie's leadership and vision, Maya's razor-sharp mind and financial expertise, and Frank's knack for corruption and connections. Together, they started pulling in real money, enough to make the long hours and the risks feel like the start of a worthwhile investment. Charlie, always looking ahead, would later say of that time, "We weren't just kids playing games anymore. We were figuring out how to make this work, how to make money that lasted, not just a few bucks to blow on a night out. We wanted more. And, for the first time, it felt like we could actually get it." The bonds they were forging, strengthened by every job and every close call, weren't just partnerships. They were the beginnings of an empire. And these men, barely out of their teens, were already starting to see the future in each other.
We had so much dough coming in, it was hard to keep track of it. Even a good counter like Meyer would get confused once in a while. We figured it would be a good idea if we opened up a bank account. There was a bank down on the Lower East Side, I think it was called the United States Bank. Lansky's uncle knew one of the big shots. Frank went over to take a look at it, to see if it's where we could put our dough. While he was looking it over, he couldn't help but kind of case the joint out a little bit, and he sees one guard, an old man who had to be 104.
Frank Costello had his eye on a local bank and decided it was worth more to them robbed than trusted. Instead of depositing their cash, the crew walked in, masked up, and cleaned the place out. Just a couple of weeks later, they hit the same bank again, walking away with over $8,000, a fortune at the time. These were the early days when Charlie Luciano, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello were simply young bank robbers, apartment burglars, and factory raiders. Their scores were small-time, but they were building the skills, connections, and reputations that would eventually redefine the criminal world. What they couldn't foresee was how one change in the law would transform them from street-level thieves into the architects of a criminal empire. The introduction of prohibition would take these young hoodlums and elevate them into the founding fathers of organized crime in America. Each man would carve out his legacy. Charlie Luciano, the visionary who would organize the underworld. Frank Costello, the master of corruption who would become the prime minister of organized crime. And Meyer Lansky, the genius mathematician who would forever be known as the mafia's accountant. Together, they would not only dominate New York, the nation's most powerful city, but also create a network that would generate more wealth than anyone could have imagined. In 1918, they were still rough around the edges, taking insane risks like robbing banks, knowing full well that a single shootout could end it all. Charlie Luciano, ever practical, accepted the odds. "You live or you die, but you don't quit," he would later say. But times were changing. In the background, the First World War loomed large. America, now fully involved in the conflict, was sending men overseas to fight alongside the British. The draft was in full swing, and Charlie Luciano's number was about to come up. For Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, youth spared them. Frank Costello's chronic throat issues rendered him unfit for duty. But Charlie didn't have such an excuse. He knew that if Uncle Sam called him up, it could be a death sentence, not just in the trenches of Europe, but for his future back home. The war could kill him, or leave him out of action so long that, by the time he returned, the streets of New York would have been carved up by other gangsters. For Charlie, staying out of the war wasn't just about survival. It was about staying in the game. The stakes were clear, and Charlie's mind immediately went to work. He needed a way out, fast. His future, his crew's future, depended on it. The streets didn't wait, and Charlie wasn't about to lose his shot at becoming the king of New York.
I wasn't afraid that if I went to war I'd get killed or nothing like that. But I knew goddamn well that if I went to Europe, by the time I got home it would be the end of me when it come to my outfit. So, the war in Europe came at a bad time. For the first time, things was going great for me, and my gang needed me a hell of a lot more than Uncle Sam. So we had a meet to figure out how to fix my draft status.
From this tangled web of betrayal, survival, and backroom deals, an unlikely chapter of underworld lore was etched into the history of Charlie Luciano. One that would be retold in smoky backrooms and whispered in dark alleys for decades to come. It was the infamous story of how Charlie "Lucky" Luciano allegedly caught the clap. The rumor mill churned relentlessly, spinning tales as wild as the man himself. But when it came to setting the record straight, Luciano didn't shy away from the gritty truth. He cleared up the sordid details with his usual blunt candor, dispelling the wildest accusations that surfaced in the aftermath of his time in Havana. It all started with an offhanded remark from none other than Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. With his trademark sharp wit, Siegel quipped in a half-serious tone, "The only way they're gonna give up Charlie Luciano to Uncle Sam is if the government hands over General Pershing." The room roared with laughter, but beneath the bravado lay a defiant truth. Luciano was untouchable, a king in exile whose infamy had become inseparable from his legend. His enemies might have wanted him gone, but his allies would trade the world before surrendering the man they saw as the true architect of organized crime's golden era. The clap, the rumors, the schemes, None of it mattered. Charlie Luciano was already larger than life, his name forever carved into the dark chronicles of underworld history.
Everybody thought that was a great joke, but when Siegel started calling me Blackjack Luciano, I stopped them jokes. But it was Siegel who come up with the idea that keeps me out of the army. He was just a punk kid, not even 14, but he knew more about broads than the rest of us put together.
Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, never one to miss a chance for a punchline, cracked another joke that would echo far beyond that smoke-filled Havana room. "The only way we can keep Luciano out of the army's hands," he smirked, "is if we give him a good dose of the clap." The table erupted in laughter, drinks spilling as men doubled over, savouring the wicked absurdity of the suggestion. But behind the veil of cigar smoke and roaring laughter, a few calculating minds at the table didn't find the idea entirely ridiculous. In their world, where survival hinged on cunning and ruthlessness, even the most outrageous jokes could inspire deadly serious plots. To them, Siegel's wisecrack wasn't just comedy. It was a twisted form of strategy. Luciano's enemies knew his influence reached far beyond the streets. The US government wanted him badly enough to consider pulling strings through the army. But a man with a scandalous affliction. Suddenly, he'd be untouchable. Damaged goods in the eyes of the system. The idea slithered into the dark recesses of mob logic, where schemes were born and lives were bought or taken with the flick of a wrist. What started as a throwaway joke might have become a whispered plan, another deadly footnote in the tangled history of Luciano's rise, fall, and enduring legend.
I looked at them like they were out of their minds and told them the idea was out, but Frank Costello assured me that with a family-friendly doctor, a case of the clap could be a breeze, and that he could keep the cure going until the war was over. And then Lansky, the mathematical wizard, says, "I got 5-2, the war won't last more than a year." I was outvoted 3-1.
Charlie Luciano played it cool, even though the situation was anything but. He knew the scheme Bugsy Siegel cooked up to keep him out of the army's clutches was outrageous, but in their world, survival often demanded the outrageous. There were still details to be sorted out, namely, where and from whom he was supposed to catch the clap. Bugsy, always 10 steps ahead, had already taken care of that. Siegel told Luciano about a brothel on 16th Street and 2nd Avenue, where he could meet a woman named Nora. Complaining and resisting wouldn't help. Not in this life. Luciano knew he had to go through with it to maintain his standing in the outfit. Reluctantly, he paid the house a visit and did what needed to be done. The price was steep. He'd be sidelined in the bedroom for a while, but it kept him active on the streets, where his true empire was taking shape. By November 1918, their gang had grown to 20 strong, ruling over Manhattan's downtown streets, where Luciano, Siegel, and Lansky had grown up, and stretching into East Harlem, where Frank Costello reigned. They hit small banks, warehouses, storage facilities, any place where cash or valuables were ripe for the taking. Their operations were precise and efficient. Siegel was always out front, casing jewelry stores under the guise of shopping for gifts for his mother, girlfriend, or sister. Once he had the layout memorized, the crew knew exactly where to strike. They never held on to stolen goods for long, funneling them through a network of eager fences ready to buy. In poorer neighborhoods, they targeted pawnbrokers and moneylenders, easy marks with cash in their registers. If any shopkeepers got roughed up, Luciano would coolly blame them for keeping so much money lying around. As the money piled up, they began investing in off-track betting, a highly profitable but dangerous venture protected by crooked cops and political fixers. They bought shares in small bookmaking operations in Midtown, planting the seeds of what would one day become a national gambling empire. The lessons came fast and hard. The public didn't mind illegal enterprises if they filled a need. With the right bribes to politicians, police, and public officials, business could thrive, insulated from law enforcement. The game was about control, of money, power, and protection. Meyer Lansky quickly emerged as the financial mastermind, finding ways to launder money and reinvest it in legitimate fronts. Unlike future crime lords like Pablo Escobar, who drowned in cash with nowhere to put it, Lansky understood how to make money work for them. His brilliance turned piles of dirty cash into stakes in legitimate businesses and, more importantly, influence. Their growing wealth bought the loyalty of street cops, who fed them valuable intelligence about rival gangs' activities. Luciano, Lansky, and Costello learned how to strike before their enemies even knew they were targets. By the 1930s, this street-level corruption expanded to entire police departments, giving the gang an army of informants and enforcers ready to neutralize any threat. Frank Costello, fresh out of prison in 1916, understood that legitimate businesses were the perfect cover for their rackets. He partnered with Harry Horowitz, a novelty manufacturer, and proposed a clever scheme disguised as innocent fun. They launched the Horowitz Novelty Company, using a $3,000 investment, mostly Horowitz's money, to manufacture toys like Cupid dolls. But Frank wasn't interested in being a toy salesman. He quickly transformed the company into a front for producing punchboards, gambling devices disguised as harmless games. The dolls became prize giveaways. In no time, Costello's toy business was generating over $100,000, a fortune in those days. He wasn't just another Italian immigrant hustling to get by. He was a visionary businessman operating in a world where fortunes were made in the shadows. Their blueprint for success was right in front of them. Arnold Rothstein, the king of high-stakes gambling, who turned illegal betting into an art form. Rothstein became their mentor, showing them that gambling wasn't just a hustle. It was an empire waiting to be built. And in the streets of Manhattan, Charlie Luciano and his crew were already laying the foundation.
Ever since we were kids, we always knew that people could be brought. It was only a question of who did this buying and for how much. After all, we saw it everywhere around us, from the police officer on the beat to the captain of the police precinct, from the ward healer to some top politician. We knew most of them guys had their hands out. It was Frank Costello, a little bit later, who really opened the door to the whole business of buying influence and protection. He had the style and class of a guy twice his age, and with that Irish-Italian name we hung on him, he was able to move in all circles. That's when we set up a private bank, not a real bank. We called it our Buy Money Bank. It started with $5,000, and the pot was turned over to Costello to use any way he saw fit.
Organized crime was evolving, and men like Frank Costello were rewriting the playbook. What modern corporations now call political funds, war chests built to sway politicians, was simply business as usual in Costello's world. They called it the Buy Money Back Bank, a stash of cash used exclusively to grease palms and ensure loyalty from politicians, police, and public officials. Within a decade, that fund swelled into millions of dollars, a bottomless well of influence. Costello understood that power wasn't just about muscle, it was about controlling the game from the inside. He started small, buying influence in districts where their bookmaking operations flourished. Local ward healers, political operatives, were paid to secure election victories by handing out cigars, turkeys, and even paying for medical treatments in exchange for votes. The community got what it needed, and Costello's crew got what they wanted: complete political cover. This strategy wasn't unique to the Italians. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem's black underworld, ran the same playbook in his communities, delivering turkeys and essential goods to the needy during election seasons. His protégé, Frank Lucas, would later follow suit, as famously portrayed by Denzel Washington in American Gangster. But long before them, it was Costello and his crew who pioneered the practice of buying public goodwill while securing lucrative political alliances. By 1919, a seismic shift was brewing in America's legal system. The ratification of the 18th Amendment promised to ban the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol, setting the stage for one of the greatest criminal booms in history. When President Woodrow Wilson signed the Volstead Act into law on October 27th, he unknowingly birthed the modern-day American mafia. But Charles "Lucky" Luciano hated the word mafia. To him, the mafia was an outdated Sicilian relic steeped in old-world traditions and rigid codes. He preferred the term outfit, a more businesslike description, much like what Al Capone called his Chicago empire. The mafia was from Italy. The outfit was American. Luciano had a clear vision even as a young man. Organized crime needed to modernize, break free from the old Sicilian customs, and become a streamlined operation driven by business, not tradition. Yet powerful, old-school mafia families still loomed large in America, like the Santo Trafficante family in Florida and the Louisiana mafia ruled by Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, who had commanded the underworld there since the early 1900s. These clans practiced old-world Sicilian methods and were deeply entrenched in their territories. When Luciano rose to power, he knew that negotiating with them, not dominating them, was the only way forward. Luciano's masterstroke was creating the National Crime Commission, an organized body of mob bosses who ruled their respective territories while working together on nationwide criminal ventures. His vote counted the same as anyone else's, but his leadership ensured cooperation. He wasn't the boss. He was a boss, surrounded by men who ruled their states with iron fists. By 1920, Luciano was becoming a respected name in the Italian enclaves of Mulberry Street. His network stretched across Manhattan and into the heart of East Harlem, where Frank Costello operated with precision. That same year, their old friend Al Capone, now a rising kingpin in Chicago, returned to New York to visit familiar faces. Capone's reputation already loomed larger than life. In Louisiana, Silver Dollar Sam Carolla and his crew rolled out the red carpet whenever Capone visited, gifting him land, restaurants, and more. He practically owned New Orleans' legendary Mosca's restaurant, which later became a hub for New Orleans boss Carlos Marcello. The FBI would eventually link the restaurant directly to organized crime, though the Mosca family always denied it. Capone also established deep roots in Florida, buying homes in Miami and building ties with the Trafficante family. He loved the South, its food, weather, and relative lawlessness. His generosity extended beyond the underworld. During the Great Depression, Capone famously opened a soup kitchen, feeding thousands. Capone was no ordinary gangster. He was a celebrity, feared, admired, and mythologized. He recruited future underworld legends like Paul Ricker, Tony Accardo, Johnny Roselli, and Sam Giancana, paying street kids handsomely to run errands. His influence connected Chicago's crime families with the South, creating a sprawling criminal empire few could rival. But even in those early years, Capone was dangerous enough that Luciano never visited Chicago without full police protection. By 1929, when gangland wars reached their bloody peak, Chicago had become America's most corrupt city. Louisiana wasn't far behind. Al Capone would go down in history as the most infamous mobster to ever live, a larger-than-life figure whose name remains synonymous with organized crime.
Capone was 3 or 4 years younger than me, a guy with plenty of muscle and guts and a way of looking ahead. He had done a couple of jobs with me. When we found out that through our contacts that the law was going to throw the book at him, I sent word to him in Brooklyn, and we arranged to meet at a dry goods store on East 14th Street that was owned by an aunt of Benny's Siegel. Capone walks into the back room, throws his arms around me and speaks. "Hey, Cousin Charlie, what's going on?" Of course, he wasn't my cousin, but he always called me that. I said, "I'll tell you what's going on. You gotta get the hell out of town and don't bother to pack." Al's face fell so much his whole body sagged. It was the first time and only time I ever seen him so scared. Maybe it was because I was the second guy in the same day who told him the same thing. The other guy was Frankie Yale, born Francisco Yale, who was the boss of the old Unione Siciliano. Al was working for him in one of his bars as a bouncer. I told Al not to worry, that I had it all arranged. I'd been in touch with Johnny Torrio out in Chicago, and he was willing to take Al on. I handed him $2,000 in small bills and told him to get right up to Grant Central and buy a ticket. He could get new clothes when in Chicago in a couple of days. Capone got so emotional he almost started crying. Then he hugged me and kissed me right on the lips, like a Sicilian, and he left. Jesus, he was no Sicilian. He was a Neapolitan, and I didn't like him kissing me that way, but what could I do? The thing I found out later was that Frankie Yale had been in touch with Torrio too, about Al, because he knew Torrio went to Chicago, and he'd done the same as me, setting things up for Capone. So Al had two of us sponsoring him when he went there, which didn't hurt him none.
Al Capone returned to New York with swagger and a story to tell. He wasn't the scrappy street kid Charlie Luciano once knew. He was working for Johnny Torrio now, running rackets in Chicago after helping Torrio take down Big Jim Colosimo. Capone was more than a rising star. He was becoming a force of nature. He met with Luciano and the crew, eager to show them just how far he'd come. During a boisterous dinner, Capone raised his glass and, with the certainty of a man already living his destiny, declared, "One day, Charlie's gonna be the king of booze." The words hit Luciano like a thunderbolt. In that moment, Capone's toast wasn't just a drunken compliment. It was a prophecy. If Capone could carve out his empire, why couldn't Charlie do the same in New York? Inspired, Luciano resolved to build something even greater. He'd seen enough of the old guard clinging to outdated codes and limiting their potential. If anyone stood in his way, he'd sweep them aside, without a second thought. The future belonged to those bold enough to seize it, but they were still just kids. Charlie was 23, Meyer Lansky hadn't even hit 20, and Bugsy Siegel was still practically an adolescent. Only Frank Costello had crossed 25. Their knowledge was limited, but their ambition was boundless. In 1920, fate introduced them to another key player, Joe Adonis, the so-called handsome gangster. Adonis, older and sharper, made an immediate impression on Luciano. They clicked instantly, forming a bond that would stretch across decades and continents. When Luciano was imprisoned in 1936, with Costello running Louisiana, Lansky operating out of Havana, Bugsy building Las Vegas, and Vito Genovese exiled to Italy, it was Joe Adonis who kept the New York rackets running. He relayed messages, kept the cash flowing, and ensured the empire didn't crumble under government pressure. Through Adonis, Luciano met Frank Scalise, a crucial underworld figure. And standing quietly behind Scalise was a young Carlo Gambino, a man with the ambition of a king and the patience of a chess master. This was the first time Luciano crossed paths with the man who would one day become the boss of bosses, inheriting and perfecting the criminal empire Luciano was building. Gambino learned by observing. He saw what worked and what didn't. Luciano's public persona drew too much heat. Gambino would stay in the shadows. He watched how Luciano worked with Jewish, Irish, and black gangsters, breaking old ethnic barriers to strengthen his organization. Gambino would adopt that model, but operate with an even lower profile. Joe Adonis played another critical role, cornering the whiskey trade just before Prohibition took full effect. With Luciano's support, Adonis gathered enough cash to buy up every barrel he could find. Frank Costello figured out the distribution routes, Meyer Lansky secured the transport, Luciano locked in the customers, and Vito Genovese supplied the muscle. By 1925, they owned the whiskey racket. By the early 1930s, Luciano was a millionaire, just as Capone had predicted, the undisputed king of booze. Luciano and Adonis were like brothers. They shared a bond built on loyalty, ambition, and even humor. Charlie never missed a chance to tease Adonis about his vanity. He'd watch Joe meticulously brushing his slick black hair in front of a mirror and crack, "Who do you think you are, Rudolph Valentino?" Adonis, never one to break character, would shoot back coldly. "For looks, that guy's a bum. Their friendship ran deeper than business. Both men shared a love for Italian ice cream, devouring bowls of spumoni no matter the season. One day, over a bowl of their favorite dessert, Adonis leaned in and asked, "Charlie, I need 10 grand for some quick business." Luciano didn't blink. He trusted Adonis implicitly. Money, loyalty, and ambition, they all flowed in one direction, toward building something bigger than themselves.
We sat there eating big plates of spumoni, and Joe said, "Charlie, I know we never done no business together and I never like to ask for a favor, but I need 10 grand to make a whiskey buy down in Philly, and I'll cut you in for half."
What Charlie Luciano didn't know was that while he was busy consolidating power in New York, Joe Adonis had been making quiet moves in Philadelphia. During one of his trips, Adonis met a man who would become essential to their growing whiskey empire. A sharp, calculating businessman named Irving Wexler, better known in the underworld as Waxy Gordon. Wexler had built a legitimate liquor distribution network before Prohibition hit. Then, with a single stroke of the legislative pen, his entire enterprise was outlawed. But instead of folding, Wexler adapted. He had the infrastructure, the contacts, and the thirst for profit. The government might have shut down legal liquor, but they couldn't stop Wexler from turning his now illegal operation into a bootlegging powerhouse. Adonis saw the potential immediately. He and Wexler struck up a close partnership, blending underworld muscle with business acumen. Wexler could handle the logistics of large-scale distribution, while Adonis brought street-level enforcement and connections. Together, they could move liquor faster and more efficiently than anyone in the game. When word of this new alliance reached Charlie Luciano, his interest was piqued. He knew that if Wexler were as sharp as Adonis claimed, they could build something far bigger than New York or Philadelphia. They could create an interstate bootlegging network unlike anything seen before. A criminal empire with industrial-scale production, distribution routes stretching from coast to coast, and political protection bought with cold, hard cash. Luciano arranged a meeting. He wanted to see Wexler for himself, to weigh the man behind the whiskey empire. This wasn't just about making money. It was about building an enterprise that could outlast Prohibition itself. If Wexler were the right man, Luciano knew they could change the game forever. And if he wasn't, well, there were always other ways to do business.
I put my arm around Adonis's shoulder and told him to keep his money, that he'd just found himself a partner that will put up all the dough. I called Costello, Lansky, and Siegel, and we got together an hour later. The four of us put up 35 grand in cash, and early the next morning Adonis and I headed out in my new car, a Marmon limousine.
Cornering a major industry required more than street smarts. It demanded control over the entire supply chain. For Charlie Luciano, the product of the hour was liquor. If they could secure a steady, reliable source, they could dominate the bootlegging market. Through Joe Adonis, Luciano saw an opportunity to lock down that crucial supply line, setting the stage for an empire. It was early 1920, and their crew already had significant cash reserves. They'd pocketed profits from their expanding gambling operations and stashed away spoils from countless robberies and stick-ups. Now, Luciano was ready to take the next step, investing everything they had into bootlegging. The first attempt to meet a potential supplier wasn't promising. The drive was only about 90 miles from New York, but the roads were a disaster. Mud holes, endless detours, and rough terrain chewed up by heavy truck traffic. Before they even made it halfway, Charlie cursed the whole venture, turned the car around, and headed back to New York. But failure wasn't an option, only a delay. Organized crime would soon find a way to fix even the roads. As their liquor enterprise grew, so did their influence. Bribed politicians funneled taxpayer money into infrastructure improvements, selling it to the public as investments in local prosperity. In reality, those improved roads became crucial bootlegging routes, carving paths across the nation for the mafia's growing liquor distribution network. Later that same year, Luciano and Adonis tried again, this time by train, first class. It was a whole different world. Charlie soaked in the fine dining, the polished service, and the luxury of the first-class cabin. For a kid who had arrived in America with nothing, it was intoxicating. As the train rolled toward Philadelphia, Luciano's appetite for success grew even sharper. He wasn't just thinking about liquor or rackets anymore. He was thinking about empire. He didn't just want to move booze. He wanted to control the entire system, from production to distribution to political protection. The opulence of that train ride wasn't just a taste of wealth. It was a vision of the future he intended to build.
That was the first time I ate in a dining car on a train. The tablecloths were so white the inside of the car looked like it was covered in snow. It was the first time I ever ate corned beef hash for breakfast. It had a fried egg on top. Joe thought I was crazy. He had a hot oatmeal and I had 2 more orders of that hash.
Charlie Luciano was becoming more American with every passing day. His habits, tastes, and even his routines were evolving. He still loved his mother's home-cooked Italian meals, but now his palate craved more: Jewish diners, delis serving sweet pastries, and late-night Italian ice cream runs with his closest friends. He often brought along Red Levine or Benjamin Siegel, making every meal an occasion. Despite his growing appetite for American life, Charlie never forgot where he came from. After returning from that first-class train ride, he eagerly told his mother about the luxurious experience, the fine dining, the polished service, and the strange new breakfast he'd tried. His mother, an old-school Italian matriarch, was baffled by his choices. "You ate what for breakfast?" she'd ask, shaking her head. She might have disapproved of his growing taste for the finer things, but she never stopped loving him. Like many mothers, she knew deep down that Charlie's success came from something dangerous, something dark. But she looked past it. She was grateful for how he supported the family. Charlie made sure his younger brothers stayed on the straight and narrow, using his connections to secure them legitimate, well-paying jobs. He even slipped them extra cash as bonuses to help their growing families. His sisters married respectable men and built lives far removed from the streets where Charlie ruled. Even years later, while in exile in Italy, Charlie stayed in touch with his nieces and nephews, keeping his extended family close while ensuring they were insulated from his criminal empire. They were family, not business. And in Charlie's world, that line was absolute. Back on that train ride to Philadelphia, something other than the elegant breakfast caught Charlie's attention. Seated nearby were 2 wealthy bankers, dressed to perfection. Sharp suits, polished shoes, the effortless confidence of men born into privilege. Charlie couldn't take his eyes off them. He studied their every move, their mannerisms, the way they spoke with authority and ease, as if the world existed solely for their benefit. Money was something Charlie understood, but class, that aura of untouchable respectability, was something entirely different. It entranced him. He realized then that real power wasn't just about money or muscle. It was about perception. Respectable men could do what criminals like him only dreamed of, all while wearing tailored suits and dining in first class. That day, Charlie didn't just see bankers. He saw the future. He would learn to blend into their world, adopting their manners, their polish, their veneer of legitimacy. He wouldn't just be a gangster. He'd be a king.
They were really elegant, like old money, and I said to myself, that's for me. Then I remembered that Joe and I were sitting there carrying guns and I got 35 grand in my pocket to buy booze with down in Philly, just so guys like them could pay through the nose for it.
The meeting in Newfoundland and Labrador changed everything. Frank Costello's daring trip across the Atlantic wasn't just a business deal. It was the first building block in what would become one of the most lucrative bootlegging empires in history. He struck a deal with the mayor of St. Pierre, securing a tax of 2 cents per case of liquor shipped through the island. By the time Prohibition ended, Costello had run more than 2 million cases of liquor through that one island alone. But Newfoundland was just the beginning. Frank turned the sleepy island into a bustling smuggling hub. Warehouses rose along the shorelines, piers were reinforced, and loading cranes swung cases of whiskey with mechanical precision. Men in fedoras, clutching their hats against the icy winds, swarmed the docks, transforming the remote outpost into a smuggler's paradise. St. Pierre became an industrial machine dedicated to one purpose: feeding America's insatiable thirst for alcohol. Costello wasn't just running a smuggling operation. He was building an empire. His fleet expanded from rusty tramp steamers to luxury yachts repurposed for cargo runs, while flotillas of lightning-fast Jersey skiffs darted through narrow inlets, outrunning Coast Guard patrols with ease. He even created a private air force, equipping seaplanes with armed guards to fend off pirates and rival bootleggers. While Costello locked down the supply side, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel secured the ground game. They ran a seamless operation from the docks to hidden warehouses, where trucks, many of them heavily modified for speed, would carry the cargo deep into the U.S. interior. These souped-up vehicles laid the groundwork for what would eventually become NASCAR, with bootleggers crafting faster, more agile cars to outmaneuver law enforcement on winding back roads. Luciano, Costello, and Lansky had built something far greater than a smuggling ring. They had created a fully integrated billion-dollar operation fueled by illegal liquor and relentless ambition. But money wasn't enough. Every dollar earned was reinvested into expanding their reach, securing influence, and bribing politicians. Their profits didn't just buy them power, they bought control. Frank Costello even admitted years later that he quietly supported Prohibition's passage, donating to politicians who pushed the legislation. He understood that outlawing alcohol would turn the liquor trade into a criminal monopoly, handing him and his crew a golden opportunity. Organized crime wasn't just reacting to the law, it was shaping it. By 1921, the group was operating on a scale they could hardly have imagined just a year earlier. Their success wasn't just about money. It was about turning a bad law into the foundation of a criminal empire. What started as a necessity, survival in the harsh streets of New York, was becoming something far greater. They weren't just gangsters anymore. They were architects of an underground economy that reshaped American history.
Within a year we were buying influence all over Manhattan, from Lower Broadway all the way up to Harlem, and even across the Hudson beyond the Palisades in New Jersey.
For Luciano, Costello, and Lansky, the key to dominating the bootlegging industry wasn't just about making deals, it was about building the pipeline. Without a steady, uninterrupted flow of liquor, even the most profitable smuggling operation would collapse. Luciano understood that reliability bred power. If they could guarantee supply, they could corner the market, secure political protection, and expand beyond anything America had ever seen. Their approach was methodical. They sent trusted soldiers, capos, and seasoned operators across the Atlantic to strike deals directly with suppliers in Scotland, England, Ireland, and the heart of Europe. They wanted the best whiskey, rum, and gin, and they didn't care how far they had to go, or how much they had to pay, to get it. This network wasn't just about Prohibition. Decades later, after the Second World War, those same transatlantic smuggling routes would morph into pipelines for gambling, narcotics, and even entertainment ventures in Europe. The relationships they built in the 1920s while smuggling liquor became invaluable when organized crime expanded into international operations in the 1940s and 1950s. Their bootlegging routes laid the foundation for a global criminal empire. But in the 1920s, the focus was clear: secure the flow of alcohol. Failure wasn't an option. Every shipment had to arrive on time. No excuses. Luciano drilled this into his men. If you can't deliver, you don't survive. A missed shipment meant lost profits and broken trust, a fatal combination in the underworld. Their logistics network became a well-oiled machine. Ships carried crates of whiskey across the Atlantic, docking at hidden ports in Canada and remote US coastlines. From there, fast-moving trucks and Jersey skiffs transported the goods inland, while bribed officials ensured the Coast Guard and local police looked the other way. Every piece of the system worked in sync, each link in the chain crucial to the next. The profits were staggering, but the money didn't sit idle. Every dollar earned was reinvested into expanding the pipeline and, more importantly, buying protection. Politicians, law enforcement, and even judges were paid off in cash, influence, or favors. Corruption wasn't just a tool, it was the engine driving their empire. Luciano understood something that few criminals of his era grasped. Power isn't just about control, it's about reliability. He wanted his organization to be the most dependable supplier in the country, not just a gang of street-level racketeers. If they could deliver consistently, they wouldn't just survive, they would dominate. And dominate they did. By the late 1920s, Luciano and his partners controlled a bootlegging network stretching from Europe to the American heartland. Their empire was built on whiskey and gin, but its foundation was something much stronger: trust through delivery, power through corruption. It was a business model that would fuel organized crime for decades to come.
When we made that first buy down in Philly, we almost hit the big time from the very beginning, like we started at the top and kept going up from there. Of course, like any big business, we had to take care of the guys that could help us, so we greased the police and the politicians. It was all part of the overhead, just like any other businesses.
Charlie Luciano and his crew were making serious money, building valuable contacts, and gaining power faster than anyone could have predicted. For Luciano, it was clear. They were sitting on a gold mine, and he needed to grab hold of the entire machine before anyone else could. The bootlegging business wasn't just about moving liquor, it was about controlling the flow. He zeroed in on the whiskey trade, a drink enjoyed by the rich and poor alike. If he could corner that market, he wouldn't just be another racketeer, he'd be the man to see for whiskey. But making money was only half the game. Keeping it was the real challenge. Their growing fortune needed to be laundered, invested, and multiplied. If they were going to build a billion-dollar enterprise, they had to learn how real businesses operated. And for that, they needed a genius. That genius was Meyer Lansky. While other street kids spent time together in gyms, boxing clubs, or pool halls, Meyer was building the strongest muscle of all, his brain. He had an insatiable thirst for knowledge, fueled by a lifelong love for books. When Lansky first arrived in America, the very first place he sought out was a free library. He enrolled the moment he found one, and from then on, it became his sanctuary. While Costello ran political operations and Luciano dominated the streets, Meyer was studying the intricacies of finance, economics, and strategy. He read voraciously, absorbing everything from business theory to world history, transforming himself into a walking encyclopedia of organized crime economics. One day, while thumbing through a new book titled Making Profits, written by Harvard professor William Taussig, something clicked. The book detailed the concept of supply and demand, a basic economic principle that suddenly seemed like the perfect framework for bootlegging. Meyer wasn't just reading about the theory, he was seeing his world on the pages. He ran straight to Charlie, clutching the book like it held the secret to the universe. "Charlie, you need to hear this," Meyer urged, launching into an explanation of how manipulating supply could increase demand and drive up prices, something the whiskey trade was already teaching them the hard way. Charlie, a street-smart hustler through and through, wasn't impressed. He leaned back, unimpressed, and said flatly, "I didn't bring you in to quote from library books." But Meyer wasn't one to give up easily. He pressed on, explaining how they could control the market and the price by creating artificial scarcity, hoarding liquor shipments, delaying deliveries, and forcing competitors into desperate buying sprees. If they could manipulate supply, they could control demand, and by extension, everything. That caught Charlie's attention. He realized Meyer was talking about more than just moving liquor. He was talking about rewriting the rules of the entire black market economy. With a smirk, Charlie muttered, "All right, kid, you've got my attention." From that day forward, Lansky's law was born. Control the supply, create the demand, set the price. It wasn't just a business strategy, it became the foundation of organized crime's vast empire. And it all started with a Harvard business book in the hands of a street-smart kid who never stopped learning.
Will you please, for God's sake, listen? You always talk about how you want to learn new things. Now I want to explain something that's important. This writer talks about a thing called the law of supply and demand. What he says applies to us right now. If you have a lot of what people want and can't get, then you can supply the demand and shovel in the dough. In other words, that's we to get ought to do with whiskey, get plenty of it. Good uncut stuff right off the boat and then sell it at a high price to a bunch of people who don't have the brains enough not to drink it.
Charlie Luciano and his crew faced a defining decision, one that would set the course of their empire and rewrite the rules of organized crime. They could take the easy route, water down the liquor, stretch every barrel, and flood the seediest speakeasies with cheap, barely drinkable booze. It would mean quick cash and high volume, but at a steep cost. They'd be labeled as peddlers of gutter-grade hooch, tied to the bottom rungs of society, dealing with desperate drunks and low-level hustlers. Or they could aim higher. They could sell only pure, uncut whiskey, the best on the market, targeting the city's wealthiest, most powerful clientele. The profits would be enormous, and more importantly, they'd build a reputation as purveyors of excellence, trusted by the city's elite. Rich clients meant deeper pockets, greater influence, and better protection through bribes. Their operation would be feared by the underworld and respected by high society. After weighing the options, the choice was obvious. They would supply only the best. They would become the source for premium liquor in New York, creating an aura of exclusivity that would insulate their operation from petty street-level crime. This became an unspoken commandment, etched into their business philosophy, Lansky's law: supply whatever is illegal and in demand, ensure a steady, uninterrupted flow, and maintain a spotless reputation. With their strategy locked in, Luciano turned to Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello to put the plan into motion. They didn't just target the typical bootleggers, they went after the garment district, the heart of New York's thriving fashion industry. This sector was ruled by manufacturers eager to court out-of-town buyers with open checkbooks during seasonal buying trips. Success in the garment world was built on hospitality, and nothing impressed buyers more than top-shelf whiskey, lavish dinners, and front-row seats at the city's hottest shows. Luciano's crew made sure they supplied it all, at a price. If male buyers wanted pretty girls, they got them. If female buyers wanted dashing escorts, gigolos were discreetly provided. Everything was arranged through backdoor deals, with the manufacturers footing the tab and signing lucrative contracts. The garment district became a goldmine, with buyers writing orders over whiskey-soaked dinners and after-hours parties supplied by Luciano's men. Their whiskey pipeline expanded rapidly. Waxy Gordon became their primary supplier, and they built their own distilleries to meet rising demand. They ran booze through every hidden route they could find, over land, by sea, and even through makeshift tunnels. As long as the liquor flowed, the money followed. It wasn't just about selling whiskey anymore. It was about power. They weren't just bootleggers. They were businessmen running a billion-dollar enterprise built on alcohol and persuasion. Every shipment that landed in New York came with strings attached: control, leverage, and influence. And as Charlie mixed more deeply into the underworld, he learned another crucial lesson. Crime isn't just about breaking the law. It's about controlling it. Power came from managing crime like a business, offering a service that even the most respectable citizens couldn't live without.
Everybody has larceny in them, only most of them don't have the guts to do nothing about it. That's the big difference between us and the guys who call themselves honest. We got the guts to do what they'd like to do, only they scared too.
As Charlie Luciano rose through the ranks of the underworld, his moral compass twisted, distorted by the company he kept and the power he craved. He no longer saw himself as a criminal, but as a businessman operating in a world where breaking the law was simply part of the job. Watching others commit the same crimes around him made it easier to justify his own actions. In his mind, the line between right and wrong blurred. After all, if everyone were doing it, how could it be wrong? His view of honest, law-abiding citizens soured. He didn't see them as honorable or principled. He saw them as weak, too afraid to take what they wanted. It never occurred to him that some men chose not to break the law because they wanted to live a decent life, not because they couldn't commit the same crimes. To Luciano, restraint looked like cowardice. Despite his evolving mindset, Luciano remained sharply focused on building his criminal empire. As their bootlegging operation expanded, his inner circle adapted, each man branching into new enterprises. The machine was growing. Frank Costello deepened ties with the Irish bootlegging king, Big Bill Dwyer, while strengthening his gambling interests across East Harlem. More importantly, he cultivated powerful political and law enforcement contacts, ensuring complete protection for himself and his partners. Costello understood that real power came from politicians' offices, not the streets. Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel founded the Bug and Meyer Gang, a ruthlessly efficient transportation and protection outfit. They specialized in moving illegal liquor and hijacking rival shipments. When needed, they played enforcers, guarding their operations with brutal efficiency. No job was too dangerous. Joe Adonis, ever the opportunist, spread his influence like a virus. His criminal footprint stretched from Brooklyn to Manhattan, earning him the feared title, Boss of the Broadway Mob. He set up shop in Fort Lee, New Jersey, eventually settling into a grand home with his wife and children, a model family man by appearances only. Luciano orchestrated this criminal symphony, overseeing expansion while forging new alliances. One rising figure caught his attention, a dangerous, ruthless upstart named Vito Genovese. Though not Sicilian, Vito commanded respect through fear in Little Italy, a feat that deeply impressed Luciano. He wanted a future that wasn't bound by old Sicilian traditions, and men like Vito could help him build it. But Vito Genovese came with dangerous flaws. He was short, muscular, and tough, with a round face and a disarming smile that concealed a cold-blooded killer. He was old-school Italian, driven by greed, violence, and a raw hunger for power. He rarely strategized. Instead, he took what he wanted through brute force, intimidation, and murder. Despite these flaws, Luciano saw potential in Genovese's relentless ambition. Vito rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming an essential piece of Luciano's expanding empire. He used his deep connections with Italian crime families across the US to build powerful alliances. Even years later, Luciano credited Genovese for uniting families and securing the structure of their criminal network. Without Vito, he would say, none of this would have ever been possible. But even then, Luciano recognized Genovese's fatal flaw: narcotics. In 1923, Luciano himself had learned the hard way when he was arrested on drug charges. It taught him a crucial lesson. The drug trade attracted too much heat, too many government eyes. But Vito never learned. He became one of the largest heroin traffickers in American history, flooding New York with narcotics throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. His greed for the drug trade would ultimately seal his fate. But in those early days, his ruthlessness was exactly what Luciano needed. Genovese wasn't just a mobster. He was a predator, relentless and remorseless, with a gun always within reach and no mercy in his heart. And for Luciano's empire to thrive, He needed a man like that. A man who could do anything without ever blinking.
I never really liked him, but he did have a moxie. I figured that if this Vito had even a half of Meyer's guts, remember, he was a little guy like Meyer, then I'd have a good man. When I first heard of him around the neighborhood, he was already making a rep for himself. He was living in a neighborhood where the Sicilians outnumbered everybody else 10-1. To us, anyone who didn't come from Sicily was a dirty foreigner, and that made it tough, especially for a little guy like Vito, who was born in some town near Naples. But he could fight like a son of a bitch. I didn't have to love him to use him, but I thought he'd be loyal. What a mistake. But I didn't find that out until many years later.
Vito Genovese rose quickly through the ranks, thanks to Charlie Luciano's calculated decision to bring him into the fold. He wasn't just a ruthless enforcer. Vito was a problem solver, a man with a bloodhound's instinct for uncovering secrets and rooting out threats. His reputation for cold-blooded efficiency made him indispensable to Luciano's growing empire. Whenever the National Commission needed something investigated, or someone eliminated, it was Vito they called upon. Luciano would later say, "Vito had the memory of an elephant and the patience of a lizard." He was methodical, cunning, and absolutely relentless. His ability to sniff out disloyalty and impose order made him the Luciano family's unofficial enforcer-in-chief. He absorbed smaller criminal outfits like a vacuum, expanding the family's power base across New York. Under his watch, the family's membership swelled to 70 men almost overnight, strengthening Luciano's hold on the city. Despite Vito's value, Luciano knew the man's fatal flaw: greed. He was too ambitious, too obsessed with power. Many times Luciano could have ordered Vito's execution for disobedience or reckless behavior, but he held back. "I knew then, like I know now," Charlie later reflected. He helped lay the foundation, even if he was too damn greedy. But Luciano also knew he couldn't rely solely on Jewish gunmen like Bugsy Siegel for muscle. It risked making him look weak in the eyes of the old Sicilian guard. He needed an Italian hammer. That's where Albert Anastasia came in. Anastasia was a firestorm in human form. He'd escaped a murder charge at Sing Sing when the key witness against him vanished, a vanishing act orchestrated by Luciano himself. Albert idolized Charlie from the moment they met, seeing in him a visionary gangster worthy of loyalty and bloodshed. His admiration turned into brutal devotion. Anastasia became Luciano's most feared enforcer, killing with impulsive rage or surgical precision, whatever the job required. He was a natural killer, molded by violence and hardened by the brutal world of the docks. Luciano used him to create Murder, Inc., an enforcement arm of the mob so lethal it became the stuff of nightmares. "We didn't talk about it," Luciano once said. "It was just there." Murder, Inc. specialized in eliminating high-level targets: mobsters, informants, and anyone foolish enough to cross the commission. Their hit list stretched into the hundreds, if not thousands. Many of its killers were hardened World War I veterans, men for whom killing had become second nature. They worked without remorse, driven by contracts and cold, hard cash. Unlike other mobs, Murder Inc. wasn't tied to any specific ethnic group. It was a melting pot of Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European assassins bound by one rule: kill without hesitation. Informants like Abe Reles and Ali Tannenbaum would eventually bring their dark deeds to light, exposing Murder Inc. in one of the most explosive revelations in American crime history. But Murder Inc. wasn't the only mob-built death squad. The Magadino crime family in Buffalo never relied on outside killers. They were the killers. In Louisiana, Carlos Marcello pioneered the infamous Patsy method, recruiting orphans from Italy for contract hits. These orphans were disposable assassins, used for one mission, then executed on the spot to eliminate any trace. The Patsy method was efficient, brutal, and terrifyingly effective, a subject worth exploring in its own documentary. Luciano's commitment to ruthless efficiency didn't stop with Italian recruits. Through Meyer Lansky, he met Louis Lepke Buchhalter, a Jewish labor racketeer and another future founder of Murder, Inc. Their first meeting at the Claridge Hotel would spark one of the most infamous alliances in underworld history. A partnership that would turn organized crime into a lethal global enterprise driven by greed, loyalty, and the relentless pursuit of power.
I took one look at him, and all I could see is a guy with a fat face, a big head, and so much muscle it was bulging out of his sleeves. Something inside me warned me this guy was mostly strong arm and very little brain. So I said to him, "Listen, Lou." He stopped me and said kind of nice, "You can call me Lepke." I couldn't help it. I started to laugh and said, "What the fuck kind of name is that?" He got all red and embarrassed and explained that when he was a kid, his mother used to call him by his pet's Jewish name, Lepkele. So from then on, we called him Lepke. How can you not like a guy who always thinks about his mother?
The meeting with Louis Lepke Buchhalter had been orchestrated by Arnold Rothstein, the master fixer and king of New York's underworld. Rothstein saw little personal use for a brute like Lepke, whose muscle-heavy tactics didn't fit his high-level schemes. But Rothstein knew someone who could turn Lepke into a lethal asset: Charlie Luciano. Luciano was intrigued by Lepke, not for his intellect. Lepke wasn't particularly bright, but for his guts, ambition, and willingness to listen when smarter men spoke. Lepke already had a foothold in the garment industry, running protection rackets through sheer terror: acid attacks, dynamite threats, arson, and brutal beatings. But to Luciano, that was wasteful and chaotic. It lacked the polish of a real enterprise. At their first meeting at the Claridge Hotel, Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello laid out a plan to reorganize Lepke's rackets into a systematic business-like operation. They explained how Lepke could transform his violent short-term hustle into a lasting empire by applying Lansky's law: organization, consistency, and dominance through control. They drew up a simple blueprint. Start with the weakest firms. Shake down small, cash-strapped manufacturers who couldn't resist paying for protection. Expand to the middle tier. With smaller firms locked in, they could pressure mid-level businesses into compliance. Take down the giants. Once they controlled the entire garment district's foundation, even the biggest companies would have no choice but to fall in line. Lepke listened and acted. His influence in the garment industry spread like wildfire, engulfing every tailor shop, clothing factory, and textile supplier in New York. The protection racket became an industry of its own, organized like a corporate monopoly. Every shipment, every contract, every piece of fabric came through their hands. Luciano's system worked so well, it became a model for other rackets. They applied the same playbook to boxing promotions, starting with struggling small-time promoters. As they secured control of the lower ranks, they moved upward, taking over the bigger names until they owned the sport from the inside. Soon, nothing in New York happened without Luciano's approval, whether it was a fight in Madison Square Garden or a garment shipment headed to Fifth Avenue. The next recruit into Luciano's growing empire came at Frank Costello's suggestion: Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was already carving out an illicit kingdom in the Bronx, running a brutal alcohol smuggling and numbers racket. His network was extensive, and his potential was limitless. Luciano saw opportunity, but Vito Genovese saw something entirely different. At another meeting in the Claridge Hotel, Costello raised Schultz's name, suggesting they bring him into the fold. Genovese exploded. His voice boomed across the table as he sneered, "What the hell is this? What are you trying to do? Load us up with a bunch of Hebees?" The air went dead. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, seated nearby, tensed visibly. They locked eyes with Genovese, their expressions darkening. The silence hung heavy. Without missing a beat, Costello fired back, delivering a line that would be etched into mob history. Take it easy, Don Vitone. You're nothing but a fucking foreigner yourself. The room froze, everyone waiting for Genovese's reaction. His face flushed with rage, but he bit back his response. For now. That moment, that insult, would never leave his mind. Years later, in 1957, when Frank Costello was ambushed and shot in the head in a failed assassination attempt, many whispered that Genovese had never forgotten that night at the Claridge. Luciano would later recall the incident with a mix of amusement and caution. Costello's defiant jab had kept things from escalating in the moment, but it also planted a seed of revenge that would grow for decades. In the underworld, nothing was ever truly forgiven.
The reason I remember that so clear is that two important things came out of it. Whenever anybody wanted to rub Vito's nose in, they'd call him Don Vitone to his face or his back, and Vito never forgave Frank for reminding him that he wasn't a Sicilian and couldn't ever really belong. That prick Vito had a memory of an elephant and the patience of a lizard, and he waited 35 years for a chance to blast Frank's head off.
Lucky Luciano was ahead of his time. He built his criminal empire on brains, not backgrounds. It didn't matter how many Jewish recruits he brought in. What mattered was what they could contribute. He didn't flinch if his crew had more Jewish members than Italians. His only loyalty was to competence. He envisioned an outfit as sharp and calculating as the one Arnold Rothstein built, a criminal corporation stacked with some of the smartest operators in America. Rothstein himself had mentored Luciano and Meyer Lansky, and now Luciano aimed to surround himself with equally brilliant minds capable of corrupting entire systems. One such figure was Abner Longi Zwilman, a rising star in northern New Jersey's underworld. A major bootlegger and racketeer, Zwilman was quiet, bookish, and obsessed with respectability. He carried on a notorious affair with screen siren Jean Harlow, earning him a touch of Hollywood glamour despite his brutal business dealings. Though Zwilman shunned the narcotics trade, he thrived in bootlegging, gambling, and other lucrative rackets, becoming indispensable to Luciano's expanding empire. Even with Luciano exiled in Italy, he trusted Longi. But by 1959, Zwilman's tax troubles spiraled out of control, setting off a chain of events that shattered that trust. Pressured by mounting legal woes, Zwilman was roped into a desperate scheme orchestrated by Costello, Lansky, Gambino, and Luciano himself to frame Vito Genovese for drug trafficking. The plan was risky, but potentially deadly for Genovese's rising power. Zwilman, leveraging his tax problems as a cover, approached Genovese with an offer too tempting to refuse: a bulk sale of pure opium at a steep discount. All Zwilman wanted was 10% of the street value, a six-figure payday. But when the narcotics agents failed to show up, Genovese slipped away untouched. 2 days later, the failed sting reached Luciano's ears in Italy. Furious, he blamed Gambino and demanded another attempt. While Genovese escaped, Zwilman didn't. His tax troubles intensified, and when he sought help, none came, not even from Meyer Lansky. Luciano saw this as a betrayal. "Money makes people do strange things," he remarked bitterly about Lansky. He loved money more than others did. By early 1959, Zwilman was found dead, hanging from a basement rafter. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. But when Luciano read the news, he spat out, "Bullshit. That was all Gambino." He believed Zwilman had tried to strong-arm Gambino for financial aid and paid the ultimate price. His death secured Gambino's dominance over lucrative New Jersey rackets. Long before this brutal ending, Zwilman had a dangerous partner, Willie Moretti. If Zwilman was a scholar of crime, Moretti would be a mad dog. Headstrong, reckless, and a notorious womanizer, Moretti built a reputation as a deadly enforcer, a volatile figure who could fly off the handle at any slight. Despite his impulsiveness, Moretti had one saving grace. He wasn't prejudiced and worked well with Jewish gangsters, something that endeared him to Luciano. Moretti's unchecked appetites eventually led to his downfall and, by extension, Svillman's. By the 1960s, both men were dead, eliminated as their world closed in. At the foundation of Luciano's vision stood Arnold Rothstein, the grand architect of modern organized crime. The prodigal son of a respectable Jewish family, Rothstein turned his gambling obsession into an empire. Rumors swirled that he orchestrated the infamous 1919 Black Sox scandal, fixing the World Series. His fortune came from gambling, fraud, narcotics, and fronting money for emerging mobsters. He was a financier of crime, willing to risk it all for bigger rewards. When Prohibition hit, Rothstein pivoted swiftly. He secured whiskey shipments from Scotland before bootlegging even became a thing. Unlike other bootleggers, he showed up at distilleries with suitcases full of cash, paying up front, a bold move that earned trust from wary Scots accustomed to empty promises. Luciano admired that audacity, calling Rothstein's foresight the best education in the world. Rothstein didn't just build a criminal enterprise, he laid the blueprint for the modern underworld, and Luciano was his sharpest pupil.
What Arnold Rothstein did was really very smart. Everybody knows that the guys in Scotland are tight and love money, so Rothstein made legit contracts with them and laid down big deposit so he would be guaranteed delivery. Then he went to Waxy Gordon for the distribution of this liquid gold, with the condition that I should have first call on the buy. Naturally, I brought every drop of it.
By securing boatloads of whiskey, Arnold Rothstein became the first to establish a steady supply chain, ensuring shipments were dropped off to underworld figures like Waxy Gordon. Gordon would cut the product and pass it along to Luciano for distribution. Charlie already had transportation locked down through the Bug and Meyer gang, muscle through Vito Genovese, political influence through Frank Costello, and a ready customer base. With all four pushing the product, alongside Joe Adonis, the Scalise crew, the Profaci family and the Mangano brothers, the operation expanded rapidly. Soon, even the Purple Gang in Detroit and Abner Longy Zwillman came knocking for a piece of the action. The illicit liquor moved faster than legitimate brewing companies could manage. The profits were astronomical. These men were shifting billions in product while branching into gambling, union control, and political corruption. Public officials handed out lucrative public contracts in exchange for kickbacks, creating an empire fueled by crime and bribes. Arnold didn't just teach Luciano how to run an enterprise, he taught him style, class, and respectability. He showed Charlie how to navigate rooms filled with predators, to act and dress like a legitimate businessman, while staying sharp and ruthless underneath the polished veneer.
He taught me how to dress, how not to wear loud things but to have good taste. He taught me how to use knives and forks, and things like that at the dinner table, about holding a door open for a girl, or helping her sit down by holding the chair. If Arnold lived a little longer, he could have made me pretty elegant. He was the best etiquette teacher a guy could ever have, real smooth.
The key to Luciano's success was having men like Arnold Rothstein and Johnny the Fox Torrio backing him. With such formidable mentors, failure was never an option. These seasoned veterans saw immense potential in Luciano and invested their time and resources into shaping him into the future boss of bosses. Luciano wasn't just a passive student. He pulled his weight. He managed all the liquor sales for Arnold, while Meyer Lansky handled the finances. Rothstein trusted these young men implicitly, molding them into a new breed of organized crime leaders. Arnold wasn't called the bankroll for nothing. He understood how to finance crime like a high-stakes investor. He fronted the money, enabling up-and-coming criminals to build lucrative operations while ensuring he got a cut of the profits. He effectively owned a share in every venture simply by being its financial architect. Luciano later reflected on his relationship with Arnold, acknowledging the invaluable lessons learned, lessons that went far beyond business. Arnold taught him how to think like a mogul, how to navigate power circles with charm and respectability, and how to maintain a ruthless edge beneath a polished exterior. It was this duality that set Luciano apart and helped him rise to the top of the underworld.
I did a lot of favors for Rothstein, too. I used to back him in poker games. We both made money, but he could spend it so fast just living that it even made my head spin, and I was a pretty good spender myself.
Charlie would give a little hint as to why Arnold was killed.
All he had to do was ask me for the dough he owed. I'd have it sent it right over. All I knew about it was that he'd welched on a bet. That was the rumor. Of course, the police officers called me in and they grilled me, but I never knew who'd done it.
Arnold Rothstein was killed around 1928. There was no way Luciano didn't know who pulled the trigger, but he kept that knowledge locked away. When asked, he simply shrugged it off. He admitted attending the funeral, but didn't linger on the matter. He had bigger fish to fry. With his organization expanding at a remarkable pace and customers lining up for product, securing whiskey sources became an urgent priority. Much of their supply came from Canada, courtesy of Samuel Bronfman, future head of the Seagram Corporation and one of Canada's wealthiest philanthropists. Back then, however, Bronfman was bootlegging enough whiskey across the Canadian border to double the size of Lake Erie, or so Luciano liked to joke. Yet problems mounted. Transporting liquor from the border to the trucks and finally to the market became a logistical nightmare. Hijackings were rampant. Rival gangs and opportunistic thieves hit trucks regularly, costing the operation millions. The East Coast highways became graveyards for stolen trucks, stripped and abandoned, feeding a booming scrapyard trade. Demand for whiskey far outstripped supply, creating yet another headache. The solution was as bold as it was inevitable: counterfeiting. If the bottles looked authentic, the labels convincing, and the taste close enough, customers wouldn't know the difference. The crew set about sourcing whiskey closer to home and creating a bootlegging empire built on deception. The counterfeiting business exploded. Once Prohibition ended, the same skills were repurposed for forging weapons permits, license plates, and identity papers. Forgery became a cornerstone of organized crime, powering its growth long after bootlegging faded. During Prohibition, it wasn't just about booze. It was about creating a fully operational underworld infrastructure. Luciano and his associates forged labels, crafted bottles, and flooded America with fake whiskey. The profits were astronomical. All they needed were the right ingredients. Everything else was already in place.
I figured on account of that we had such a good contact in Philadelphia with Waxy Gordon. It was the place to make the move for one reason. They had a lot of companies down there turning out pure grain alcohol.
Without grain alcohol, there could be no whiskey. But with it, real whiskey could be stretched, cut and diluted, while still maintaining surprisingly good quality. Securing grain alcohol became essential, and a loophole in the law provided the perfect opportunity. Alcohol production for consumption was prohibited, but small-scale manufacturing for medicinal purposes remained legal, provided it was prescribed by a doctor. This legal grey area created a goldmine. Government licenses were issued to legitimate companies allowed to produce medicinal alcohol. These companies soon found themselves in the crosshairs of the underworld. Some owners were strong-armed through threats of violence. Others saw the potential for profit and willingly became partners. For those who resisted, selling out often became the only option. With control of these distilleries, the mob's profits skyrocketed. By mixing grain alcohol, unaged whiskey, and a dash of caramel for colour, they could turn one bottle of authentic Scotch, Canadian whiskey, American rye or bourbon into several bottles, with minimal quality loss. The partnership between Waxy Gordon and Charlie Luciano thrived under this booming enterprise. Both men grew richer, leveraging the perfect blend of cunning, force, and business acumen to dominate the liquor trade.
I never had a real problem with Waxy Gordon from the day we met down in Philly. We shook hands, and in about half an hour, it was all settled. Prices, spills of goods, profits, the whole deal.
Without grain alcohol, there could be no whiskey. But with it, real whiskey could be stretched, cut and diluted, while still maintaining surprisingly good quality. securing grain alcohol became essential, and a loophole in the law provided the perfect opportunity. Alcohol production for consumption was prohibited, but small-scale manufacturing for medicinal purposes remained legal, provided it was prescribed by a doctor. This legal grey area created a gold mine. Government licenses were issued to legitimate companies allowed to produce medicinal alcohol. These companies soon found themselves in the crosshairs of the underworld. Some owners were strong-armed through threats of violence, others saw the potential for profit and willingly became partners. For those who resisted, selling out often became the only option. With control of these distilleries, the mob's profits skyrocketed. By mixing grain alcohol, unaged whiskey, and a dash of caramel for colour, they could turn one bottle of authentic Scotch, Canadian whiskey, American rye or bourbon into several bottles, with minimal quality loss. The term rum running was born when Scottish distilleries started squeezing the underworld by jacking up prices and limiting deliveries. Shipping companies, wary of legal repercussions, refused to transport contraband. Forced to adapt, the mob chartered their own ships to the 3-mile limit, where they offloaded cargo onto faster speedboats for the final stretch. In the 1920s, speedboats became essential tools of the trade. Crews would race out to the 3-mile limit, retrieve alcohol shipments, and dash back to shore. This method was so effective that it resurfaced decades later during the cocaine boom of the 1970s and 1980s. Smugglers used the same tactic, dumping cocaine at sea and retrieving it with high-speed boats. Frank Costello was a pioneer of this smuggling method. His vision extended beyond alcohol. He engineered similar operations for narcotics, leveraging remote locations like Newfoundland and Labrador, a French territory turned underworld stronghold. The island became a key launching pad for smuggling operations into America, particularly under the watchful eye of the FCM. Charlie Luciano explained the challenges of these ventures with a mix of pragmatism and disdain. He noted how foreign companies, emboldened by changing US laws, often squeezed American gangsters. Reflecting on the constant push and pull of power, he would say,
"They knew we was bootleggers and gangsters, and then there was only delivering the stuff to a point in the ocean outside the 3-mile limit. That is, if they were delivering it at all. Lots of us, and Rothstein was the first, had to charter our own ships to carry the Scotch to the 3-mile limit. Then we had to take all the chances of running the goods into shore in speedboats. That's how the name Rum Row and the Rum Runners got started, running the boat from Cuba with rum or anything else we could buy and land."
The moment those crates of Scotch hit the ground, the game was already in motion. The top-tier clients, the ones who mattered, got their bottles pristine and untouched, straight from the source. The rest? They were funneled over to Gordon's, where the liquid gold met its fate, watered down, stretched thin, and repackaged for the less discerning crowd. In this business, quality was currency, and only the chosen few ever drank the real thing.
We made what we called Scotch right off the boat, and that the original Scotch would bring us in as high as $1,000 a case. The case costs us, if you forget the danger part of it, only around $25. But what the hell, we took all the gambles. The 3-mile limit was loaded with sharks, federal men, hijackers with speedboats. A guy could easily get killed at that time for a case of Scotch. And of course, sometimes we lose a truck or even a whole shipment to the feds or to some hijackers, and we'd have to write it off.
Charlie wasn't just running a criminal operation. He was constructing an empire. What began with bootlegging quickly morphed into something far more complex, a sprawling business network built on necessity, cunning, and sheer ambition. Every challenge in the illegal liquor trade became a new business opportunity. They needed plants to dilute the alcohol. They bought warehouses, bottles that looked like the originals. They acquired a glassworks company, labels identical to Johnny Walker, Haig and Haig, Dewars. They invested in printing presses, becoming one of the largest consumers of paper and ink in the region. Storage space became critical, so they plunged into real estate, securing properties under dummy corporations. Transportation was essential, prompting the creation of vast trucking companies. Every move was calculated, every venture tied to another, forming a tangled web of legitimate fronts covering illicit operations. By the 1930s, Charlie and his associates weren't just bootleggers. They were captains of industry in a shadow economy rivaling legitimate corporations. Their empire stretched from New York to Louisiana, where Costello expanded the syndicate's southern reach. Controlling both the North and the South meant influence at the highest levels of power, a reality that wasn't lost on them. America, still in its industrial prime, was a sleeping giant. Its factories churned out steel, automobiles, and weapons, building a nation's infrastructure from the ground up. Every bolt, every screw was made in America, and Charlie's crew saw a similar opportunity in crime. They understood that they weren't just running rackets. They were constructing a business that could stand beside giants like U.S. Steel and General Motors. This was still the early 1920s, long before Luciano would formally organize the national mafia. But even then, the seeds of something monumental were being sown. New York, a beacon for immigrants chasing the American dream, became fertile ground for organized crime. Waves of Italian immigrants arrived, some chasing honest work, others bringing old-world criminal traditions with them. Men like Salvatore Maranzano planted roots and extended their reach across New York. Their power seeped into local politics and business. They were feared, respected, and, perhaps most crucially, needed. They weren't just criminals, they were power brokers, deeply entwined with the city's economy. Charlie dreamed big. He looked at the titans of industry, Standard Oil, General Motors, U.S. Steel, and saw himself among them. His organization was just as sophisticated, just as relentless. He even adopted progressive hiring practices, bringing women into roles as accountants, cash couriers, and bookkeepers, long before corporate America would do the same. They recruited anyone who could be trusted, regardless of ethnicity, though they kept Italian family members out of direct involvement for protection. Jewish women became indispensable as bookkeepers and trusted cash runners. Irish, Jewish, and other non-Italian women could slip through police dragnets with ease, avoiding the suspicion that shadowed Italian-looking men. This pragmatic inclusiveness extended the reach of their empire, solidifying their grip on a world where trust was currency and betrayal was fatal. The empire they built wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a criminal corporation that rivaled the might of America's most powerful industries. By the 1950s, they would be bigger than U.S. Steel, and Charlie would stand at the center of it all, equal parts visionary, gangster, and industrialist.
I'll bet in the days when me and my guys got our whiskey business together, we had a bigger company than Henry Ford. We controlled plants, warehouses, all kinds of manufacturing. We had a fantastic shipping business, and our drivers had to drive good and shoot straight. We had bookkeepers that Lansky used to watch over like a hawk, and these wasn't little guy with green eye shades. These guys, and we even had plenty of girls as bookkeepers, was guys with photographic memories because not too much of their numbers even got on paper. We had exporters and importers, all kinds of help that any cooperation needs, only we had more. And we had lawyers by the carload, and they were on call 24 hours a day. Guys always told me later that I should have put my brains to running a legit business, and I'd have been a tremendous success. But I wouldn't have enjoyed it like what I was doing.
Around Charlie, a constellation of sharp minds and ruthless operators flourished, each a king in his own right, ruling over his slice of the underworld. Men like Meyer Lansky, the financial wizard, Frank Costello, the political fixer, Bugsy Siegel, the visionary with a taste for violence, Joe Adonis, the suave enforcer, and Vito Genovese, the power-hungry tactician. They weren't just lieutenants. They were architects of their own legacies, shaping the criminal empire that would define an era. What set them apart was their willingness to follow Charlie's lead. They saw in him what few others could, an equal parts street-smart hustler and master strategist. He wasn't just another thug with ambition. He was the force that could unify their scattered rackets into one seamless operation. His youth only made his rise more astonishing. At 26, he had already outplayed, outgunned, and outlived many who had underestimated him. Born into grinding poverty in Sicily, Luciano came to America as a penniless immigrant who couldn't even speak English. The streets were unforgiving, teeming with crooks, con artists, and violent gangsters. But Charlie didn't just survive, he thrived. His brilliance lay in seeing the bigger picture, in understanding that power wasn't just muscle. It was money, connections, and control. At an age when most men were still figuring out their lives, Charlie Luciano was reshaping organized crime into a modern, corporate-like empire. He was young, daring, and impossibly resilient. In a world where lives were cut short by bullets or betrayals, he defied the odds and made history.